Hey everybody, welcome back. This is our second HTML section with the horribly uncreative title, Next Steps, or at least that's the working title. It may change because it's so uncreative, but it is accurate. These are the next steps in HTML. So we've got a decent mix of concepts that are crucial and then things that are nice to have. And as you can see, most topics in this stack of cards are green. They're relatively short or easy topics to pick up. The first thing that is definitely crucial are really just two conceptual topics. The first one is understanding what HTML5 actually is or what it isn't. That won't take a whole lot of time. It's just something we get out of the way right up front at the top of this section. Same goes for block versus inline elements. This is just a concept about HTML elements that you need to understand. Crucial. And then span and div elements, two very commonly used elements, easy to pick up. They go in the crucial category as well. But then we've got a decent chunk of nice to have elements that you really do not need to stress or panic about, that you probably won't use all that often. Sub for subscript, sup for superscript, HR for a horizontal rule, and break elements for a line break. So nice to have, I'm going to show them to you, but I just don't want them to be the main takeaway from this section. Now, in contrast, this yellow card, semantic elements, is a group of multiple elements, and they're all very straightforward, very easy to understand. The only reason I made that card yellow is because there's a decent number of these elements. Just off the top of my head, you'll see header, footer, main, nav, section, article, and there are others I'm forgetting. They're all very similar, and we'll talk about this idea of semantics and accessibility. It's all important stuff, so it's in crucial, but again, it's only yellow because there's just multiple elements I'll introduce. And then lastly, we have another VS Code tip. This is for a tool that's built into VS Code. It's called Emmet, and I'll put this in nice to have as well. I really like using Emmet. It can save you a lot of time, but it can be a little bit, the syntax can be odd or difficult to remember at first. So it's 100% nice to have. Don't let it slow you down or hold you back from moving on with more HTML. Okay, so that's the breakdown of this section. Just a couple of key concepts and quite a few nice to haves. Let's go. All right, so in this video, I'd like to talk about the shadowy group in charge of HTML. They're not shadowy at all, and how HTML changes and what HTML5 actually means. I see a lot of confusion around this with students, and with good reason. HTML5 sounds like it's a version that you download or you install or you upgrade to. Just like, I don't know if you ever play video games, Civilization 5 is a discrete, separate thing from Civilization 4 or Halo 3 versus, you get what I'm saying, hopefully. HTML5 is a little bit different. If we actually go to MDN, this is their little blurb about it. HTML5 is the latest evolution of the standard that defines HTML. The term represents two different concepts. It is a new version of the language of HTML with new elements, attributes, and behaviors, and HTML5 also refers to a larger set of technologies. This is nothing you really need to care about right now, but it includes different technologies that help us build websites with 3D graphics and storing information in the browser, things that are technically not HTML. But we still call them HTML5, or people in the past have called them HTML5. This whole new set of things was called HTML5 or HTML5 and friends. So this makes it kind of confusing. The term HTML5 refers to new stuff in HTML, and it also refers to this big bundle of stuff for the browser that does include new HTML elements, but it also includes all of this stuff here. New stuff for CSS, new stuff around 3D graphics, upgrades for performance and enhancements. It's a lot of stuff, and it's not all HTML, so that can be very confusing. So when I say HTML5, I'm referring to just the latest evolution of the standard that defines HTML. So what am I saying standard? What does that mean? Why is it a standard that defines HTML? Well, the way that HTML works is that there is not one official copy that you download. We never install HTML. Instead, HTML is defined basically as a set of instructions for how HTML should work. There's a document called the standard, the HTML standard, that says, here is how HTML should work. Now, your mission, if you choose to accept it, is to take these plans and actually implement HTML in a browser. So Google goes and looks at those plans and they build HTML in their browser in Chrome. That's the house we see here. Mozilla does the same thing, and they build HTML, or they build Firefox, which is built on top of that HTML standard. Internet Explorer, all these different browsers and these companies are going to implement HTML based off of that standard. And we can actually see this standard. If you go to html.spec.whatwg, I usually just Google HTML spec, although frankly, you probably don't need to ever come here, but I like to show this when I'm teaching. This is a document that just explains, among other things, it details how HTML should work. So if we look at something like, let's scroll down a bit and look at the anchor element right there. What we get here is a bunch of details about how it should work. So there should be an attribute called href. It's the address of the hyperlink. There should be, what else? Here's some rules about it. If an A element has an href attribute, then it represents a hyperlink labeled by its contents inside the opening and closing tag. It even details what should happen when it's activated. When you click on it, follow the hyperlink or download the hyperlink created by that A element, blah, blah, blah. You don't really need to care about any of this, but my point in showing you this is to hopefully have you understand that this is just a document that explains how these elements should work and how HTML should work. Browsers then have to go and implement this. So when we say HTML5, it is not a version of something you download or install. It's just a version of this document. And this document includes new elements. As an example, the video element, the audio element, we have not seen those, but those are new-ish. They weren't around 15 years ago in HTML, and they're part of this document. So browsers then take that and implement it. They make it work in Chrome or in Firefox or in Edge or whatever browser you're using. So I think that's enough for now. You could have gotten along just fine without knowing any of this, but I do like to clear this up because I hear students talking about upgrading to HTML5 and things like that. That's not really at all what you do. Your browser and the company behind it, or the organization behind it, is going to implement features based upon the latest version of the spec, this HTML standard. And the other thing you should know is this doc type tag that we put at the top, this declaration. What this does is it indicates to browsers that this document uses HTML5 syntax, or it uses that version of the standard. But what's really confusing is that you could leave this off, or you can actually specify that nobody really does this, but you could specify that you want to use an older version, that this document does not contain HTML5. Maybe it's older. That will still be ignored. If you include elements in here like an audio or a video element, the browser's just going to recognize it. So this actually doesn't do a whole lot for us most of the time. It's just a way to flag to browsers that, yes, I'm using the latest and greatest in HTML in this document. So it's kind of confusing, right? It's not something that we can control as a user. There's this Quora post that I thought was interesting. How do you disable HTML5 in Chrome? You don't. There is no way to disable it. This is kind of what I was talking about, these other doc types that we can include. HTML 4.0.1 or 4.01 transitional, if you add this doc type to the top of your HTML document, it does not really change anything. It tells the browser what it should be expecting, but it won't turn anything off. It's just telling the browser what it should expect. So just keep that in mind. If you have room in there, this is not essential information. What is essential is this idea of the standard, of a specification that browsers then implement. All right, so next up, we'll get back to writing some code. Next up, I'm going to introduce two new elements, divs and spans. But first, two important keywords, inline and block elements. These terms refer to how a given element actually fits in with the flow of content in a document. So we've already seen this before, just with this example website, or I don't want to call it a website, this example document we created. We have something like an H1 or an H2, which automatically takes up the entire line of content. It doesn't matter if there's something after it that could fit here, it's booted onto the next line. Versus something like an anchor tag, we have two of them right here, and an image actually. They share that space. This anchor tag is not forced onto its own line. This one's not. They are happy to coexist together. So we have two different types of elements here. We have block level elements like a H1 or H2, all the heading elements. Also a paragraph is another example of what we've seen so far, where if we added a paragraph anywhere, let's just do it up top though to start. Let's do an anchor tag, I'm just going to type some gibberish in here. Let's do 2 anchor tags. I'm going to delete this anyway. Those are not block level. They are inline elements. They share the space. You can see them there. As soon as I add a paragraph or an H1 in here, in between the two, it doesn't matter that VS Code is going to put that paragraph on its own line. That doesn't make a difference in terms of behavior. Now you can see what happens. We have our first anchor tag, then we have this paragraph, and this paragraph wants to exist on its own line, its own block. So it takes up an entire block. And if we actually inspect this element, right click, inspect, and I hover over that paragraph or the P element, you can see how it goes all the way across the screen. All that blue stuff, even if it's empty, there's not enough content to fill it, it does take up that whole block. Compare that to this anchor tag. Its blue highlight around it is really just the content, and that's it. Or if we look at one of these anchor tags down here, they share the space. Okay, so that's the basic idea between a block element and an inline element. We can change this behavior using CSS later on, but it's an important distinction. And it now leads us to 2 elements I'm going to introduce, the span and the div, both of which are kind of generic containers, generic elements that may not seem that useful right now, but it's important to cover them. So let's begin with divs. I would bet if you asked the majority of developers who use HTML, most of them would not know what div means or why it's called a div. Apparently, it's the content division element, so division, divider. Most people don't know that, at least in my experience, at least. It could totally be completely wrong, but that's just my personal experience. It's kind of a weird term, but div is just a generic container to hold things or to group elements together. And it is a block level element. So if I add a div around some content, that div is going to take up a whole block and force content above and below it. Now, why would you do this? Right now, we don't really have a good reason to do it. But once we get to CSS, we can use divs as a way to group content together. You can see this example right here. There's actually, if I just get rid of all of this CSS for a moment, there's an image and there's a paragraph all the way down here. It says, beware of the leopard. And then there's a div wrapping them so that they are grouped together. And then we can style them. We can add CSS to add a border around the div. So it's just a way to group content together to treat it similarly. Or to do something with it. So, for example, can you see this background here, this slight grayish light blue background? Well, there's a bunch of elements in here. We haven't talked about buttons, but there's a button. There's probably more buttons here, an image here for that logo. This is probably some some heading element. But there's a border and a background around everything. They're grouped together, most likely using a div or one of the more modern alternatives that we'll see shortly. So for now, divs are not going to seem useful, but I'm just going to show them to you briefly. I've got my 2 anchor tags right here. You can see them right there. I am a link to Google and about page. Now, if I wrap them in a div, just like that, I now have put them inside of a block level element. So they are going to take up their own block. Well, the div is, and they happen to be inside that div. So I'm going to refresh, and there you go. So if we inspect now, you'll see that right here I've still got my 2 anchor tags. They are still just inline elements. They take up the minimum amount of space they need. But the div that I'm highlighting right now goes all the way across. It takes up a full block. So again, divs won't seem very useful at the moment, but when we get to CSS, they allow us to group content together and style it all at once. Here's another simple example. We've got an image and then some sort of description, a paragraph, and then a button here. And then there's a border around all of that. So there's not just a border around the image or a border around this or a border around the this other image or the button or whatever this is. It's around everything. So they're grouped in some sort of container. Same thing over here or this right here. All of these examples happen to be with a border, which is not the only thing you would do with a div, but they're just convenient to show right now since we haven't actually seen any CSS. Okay, so the next element that I'm going to show you kind of serves a similar purpose. It's called a span. And the span is another generic container, but it is an inline element. So we would wrap this around any sort of text or content that we want to single out later on to style with CSS or to do something with. and it's just a generic element. So here, using CSS, all the ingredients, it looks like basil, pine nuts, garlic. Ooh, sounds like pesto. I love pesto. Basil, pine nuts, garlic, and olive oil are red. So there's not a red element that we could use, and we don't want to make them bold, so we're not going to use like a B element or something like that. A span is just a generic element that we can wrap around, in this case, each ingredient. So there's a bunch of spans, and then using CSS, we can add some styles to those spans. So again, we're not doing that now. We will eventually. It's pretty soon, honestly. But that's the point of a span. So same idea as a div, except for that main big difference. A span is inline. So it does not take up its own block of content. It's just a way to call something out so we could style it differently. So here's an example. I'm on Reddit, the chickens subreddit. And if you notice, some of these titles have these tags. Roasted chicken, and then it says media here. It looks like there's some other options. Here's more media. It says we can do media, discussion, and question. So anyway, this right here is just text, just regular old text inside of, if we inspect it, this is one of the reasons the DevTools, or the reasons I showed you the DevTools is so we can do things like this. If I inspect it, it looks like it's an H3, and then this right here is a span. If you can see that, there's a bunch of other stuff, but it is a span, and it's singled out so it can be treated differently. It can be styled. It's given that rounded corners there, sort of a pill shape. It's given a background color. So that is done using a span. It's just a generic thing, right? We don't need to make this, I guess it could be a button, which we haven't covered, but it's just a piece of text. So it doesn't make sense to make it a heading or to make it an anchor tag or something. It is just a piece of text, so we single it out using a span. So once again, spans are inline, so I could add a span around something like, let's do it around Google. The word Google there. We won't see anything change whatsoever. I'm going to refresh. Nothing happens, but if I inspect, there now is this generic, let me make that a bit larger, this generic span wrapping around the word Google. So I could then go style it differently once we talk about CSS. So those are divs and spans. Again, not that useful for now, but there's a reason I'm introducing them this early on. Next up, I'm going to run through an assortment, a small assortment of unrelated elements that are just quick and easy for us to talk about. And the first one is the HR, the horizontal rule element. Not something you'll use very often, most likely, but you may encounter it. I'll just show it to you. It is an element that does not have a closing tag. So it's just HR. There's no content, no attribute that we need to provide. And it just makes by default at least, a line going across the screen horizontally. It's kind of like a divider. They describe it on MDN as a thematic break, or it represents a thematic break between paragraph level elements. So this could be a change of scenery in a story or a shift of topic. Usually it's just a line, but you can style it and you can change how it appears. But I'll just show you it right now. How about after our H1, we'll write HR. Just like that. Refresh, and there it is. Stunning, right? Remember, you can change that. You can make it look however you want. You can even get this effect without an HR. You can add a border to the bottom of an H1 or some other element. But that's an HR. While we're here, another option or another element, definitely not commonly used, is the BR, or the break, line break element. This just makes a break. It makes a break in your content, a line break. And really the one situation where I do think it can be useful is something like this here, where we have a poem and we want to control the line breaks specifically. We could just make a bunch of paragraphs. So this could be a paragraph, that could be a paragraph, that could be a paragraph. But that kind of defeats the purpose of what a paragraph is supposed to represent. A paragraph is a chunk of content that is kind of grouped together. So you could use the break, the BR elements, to make your little poem here and have your lines break exactly where you want them to. So I have a poem on my clipboard that I'm going to paste in here somewhere. Let's do maybe just an H2. Auguries. How do you spell augury? Jeez. Of innocence. Okay. And then I'm going to make a paragraph. And here's my poem in there. I'll paste that in. And if I just left it like this and refreshed, well, we end up with one massive line of text. Those breaks are ignored. But if I use a BR, wherever I put that, it will create a line break. So it's a way of saying I explicitly want a line break here. I still want this content to be grouped together, so I'm not going to just use a bunch of paragraphs or some other option. I want this whole thing to be a paragraph, but I want to control the spacing or the lines. So there we go. That's one option. BR for break, HR for horizontal rule. Now the next two elements are kind of a pair. They're not that commonly used, but you will see them, especially on things like Wikipedia. They are the superscript and subscript elements. So we use them to designate text as superscript. So superscript is text that is elevated off of the baseline, like an exponent here, a squared plus b squared is c squared. Or if we go to Wikipedia, the citations, I don't know what you call that there, but that link, that is superscript, right? It's elevated off the baseline. And I'm sure if we actually inspect, well, I hope that's what we'll see. There we go. It's a sup element for superscript, SUP. So I'll show that very briefly. Why don't we do a fake citation? Actually, I think we have, sure, let's do one of these right here. So we've got that 2 in brackets. All I need to do is SUP and then put my content inside. This might be a little hard to see because it is such a tiny change. But if I pay close attention, there it is. It's now treated as superscript. So I could also nest other content in there. I could make an anchor tag, which is exactly what Wikipedia does. Give it an href and set that equal to, I don't know, source, some source.com or something. And now we've got our link that is superscript. So we nested content inside of it. And then we have subscript, which is the element sub, sub, and this will create text that is rendered below the baseline and sometimes smaller as well. So things like this here, where we've got chemical formulas in chemistry. I'm sure there are other examples. I don't use it very often, but you'll see it. Let's just do a simple example of maybe H2O or something. Let's do, how about, we'll go down to the bottom here. And after our image, we'll do an H2 again. I like H2O. And I'm going to make that 2 on the baseline. So H, and then I want to sub around the 2. Just like that. And there we go. I like H2O. You could also do fractions with this. So we could have another example. Let's just do, I don't know, a paragraph. How about 1/2? So we would have something like 1/2 plus 1/2 equals 1. Well, if I wanted to try and make this a bit more fraction-y, I could do 1 over and then make 2 subscript. And let's see how that looks. I think it might look a little odd. It's okay. What if we make this part superscript? Put the 1 right there. Okay, yeah, that looks better. That looks like a nice little fraction. So, yeah, I guess I can duplicate that twice. That's a good example now. We've got superscript and subscript working together to make our fraction. All right, so we covered HR, BR, sup, and sub, a collection of quick assorted elements. Next up, we're going to talk about HTML entities. So on this slide, in blue text, there is an ampersand and then a pound sign, 9824 semicolon. Does anyone have any idea what that is? I don't know why I'm asking because I can't tell if any of you are raising your hand or not, but this is basically what I would do in person if I was teaching this. This is an example of an HTML entity or an entity code, or there's different ways of referring to it, but basically it's an HTML entity. So what are these? Well, they are special codes or special sequences that we can use inside of our HTML that will result in different characters. So these characters could be something that is reserved in HTML. I'll show you some examples of that. Or it could be something that's tricky to type, like a copyright symbol, or maybe a diamond, or a cross, or an arrow. There are different characters that are just not really easy to type on a keyboard. So these HTML entities allow us to add those characters in. I kind of regret making this little animated slide. I thought it would be cool, but it's just very distracting at this point. So they all start with an ampersand. They all end with a semicolon. That's what I was trying to show here. Ampersand, semicolon. And then in between, we put some string of characters. So there are quite a few of them. I'll show you, let's see. Here's a reference. I believe this is all of them. These are all different symbols, characters, entities, different things that we could add in to our document. For example, there's copyright. We've got a whole bunch of accents and different letters from different alphabets, international alphabets, like this numero thing, a trademark symbol, arrows, lots of things. So I'll show you a few examples to start. One thing that is pretty common that you may need at times is to use a reserved character. So in HTML, there are a couple of characters that you just are not supposed to use because they are significant to the syntax of HTML. First of all, the less than and greater than brackets. So if I wanted to have, for some reason, I don't know, an H1 where I was writing, how about 1 is less than 6? I don't know why I want to write that, but that's what I want to write. That's what I want to show up in the document. Well, as soon as I save here, first of all, VS Code is unhappy with me, or it's confused because its algorithm to auto-format this document sees this less than sign, and it assumes that this whole thing is some sort of tag, that this is a tag that has been opened but not closed. It gets confused. This is reserved in HTML. Now, my browser actually is okay. It works past it, and it's able to still display everything the way it should. But this is a reserved character, and it could cause problems. And if you do need a less than or a greater than, you should not add them like this. Instead, we use entity codes, and we can find them. It's easiest, in my opinion, just to search for the exact one you need. So something like HTML entity less than. And then you'll see right away, actually, the solution or the code that we need, ampersand LT semicolon, so less than. So we just replace it with ampersand LT semicolon. Now that one is very easy to remember, as is greater than. So we don't really see a difference, but now you can see that VS Code has forgiven me. It doesn't get all freaked out. Let's do one more. Here we'll do greater than, so ampersand and then GT semicolon, and then how about just another number? Actually, that would be a lie. 6 greater than, I don't know, 6 greater than 5? Sure. And there we go. So less than and greater than signs. The other character, at least one more reserved character that you should not use, is the ampersand itself. So if I put an ampersand in there, I don't think we'll have any problems. In VS Code, we won't see any issues, but this is a reserved character. The browser thinks that this represents the start of an entity code. So there is an ampersand character, or an entity code. It's amp. So ampersand amp semicolon, and that will give it to us. So ampersand amp semicolon. We shouldn't really see anything different. All right, so I'll show you a few other examples. Every entity also has a number that you can use. So there's an entity name. For example, we had less than, which was LT. See if I can find that on this cheat sheet. But we could also have done ampersand and then this hash sign, also called the octothorpe, 60 semicolon. But obviously this is easier to remember. So we also have less than or equal, greater than or equal to, all these other mathematical symbols. And then we've also got things like the suits for a card deck. So let's just add one of those quickly. Ampersand spade, or spades, that's actually what I had on the slides when I was asking you if you knew what that was. Right here, 9824. It's the same thing, but it's just easier to do it this way. So we could put a spade in there if we want. Refresh. There it is. We could put a heart in there. Ampersand. I think it's just hearts. Is that right? Yep. And that's kind of all there is to these entity codes. So if you ever see something like this in your markup, don't panic. Or if you see something like this, or even if you see something with these numbers, just remember if it starts with an ampersand and it ends in a semicolon, it's going to be replaced when it's rendered in the browser. So it is not exactly what it seems. It's just a special code that the browser can recognize to display either things that are difficult to type. How would you type spades, or this character, or things that are reserved like less than and greater than and the ampersand. All right, so that's entities. So next up, we're going to talk about one of the more recent developments or trends or just important ideas in the world of HTML, something called semantic markup. So this is something we'll expand upon in the next few videos. It's nothing crazy or hopefully not very difficult to understand. This visualization here is a huge waste of my time. I don't know why I made it. It's a C-man with a tick. Semantic. Yep. You can tell I sometimes struggle just making these slides alone and then recording these videos alone and editing them alone. I'm all alone, so I entertain myself with horrible slides. I regret it. So here we go. Semantic markup. The term semantic itself, independent of code or HTML, just means something relating to meaning. So semantic markup is meaningful markup, or markup that relates or pertains to the meaning of the content of that element. So I'm going to start by showing you the older non-semantic approach to writing documents. Here is a website that I actually really like. It's medium.com, great blog. And I don't know, is that what you'd call it? Just a blog, sort of writing publication. I don't know. It's a platform for people to write. Now, if we look at it, it looks nice and modern and clean and easy to understand, nice design. But if I open up the DevTools, and I'll make this a bit larger so you can read it better. If we look at what the actual elements are that are being used here, look at that, div, h2, and then div, okay, and then let's keep going down. Let's look at something. I mean, it's not fair if each one of these is a div. Sure, that's all of these right here. But let's look at another part. How about this right here, this section of content? Let's inspect it. Well, if we look at that, we've got a div with a div with a div with another div and a div and a div and an h2 and then a div. This is meaningless markup. Looking at the actual elements here, how would you know what this is supposed to be or what this is or what this is? It's just meaningless. It's just generic divs or just containers. Of course, it's styled and it looks nice and it's easy to understand here, but the markup itself is just a whole bunch of divs. Now let's compare that to another website. This is Stripe's website. And I'm going to open this up here. It's got a kind of similar layout in the sense that we have these chunks of content, like a section there, right? We've got this section here. Here's another group of stuff. It's kind of similar. There's some sort of footer at the bottom. There's a navigation thing at the top. And if we look at what Stripe does, we open up the DevTools, we'll inspect. There's still going to be divs, but let's start at the very top. We've got an element here called main. This is a new element we haven't seen. And this element is exactly the same as a div in how it works or what it does, except it just has a different name. And it just means that this is the main content of the page. If we go to Medium, what do we have? Well, just a div. Div. So this is a very simple change, but main indicates this is the main content. Now, we'll talk about why this matters in just a bit, but let's keep going. What do we have next? Oh, we've got a header element. So this also functions exactly like a div, and it's just the header of the page. And if we open that up, what do we have? All right, we've got a div, and then we've got a section of content, a section element, another new element we have not seen. It's exactly the same as a div, but a different name. And then if we open this up, we've got more stuff in here, right? I expanded a couple of other things. Right here, we have nav elements. So navs for navigation, just like divs, but they are called navs. And they tell us what they do. They are meaningful. Compare that to what we have on Medium. I feel bad for ragging on Medium. Obviously, these are very talented developers. What do we have? Div with a div with an h4 with more divs. There's no nav here, but a nav would be perfect. This is navigation. That's all that it's there for. These are navigation links. Why not use an element like a nav? Well, the main reason is that these elements are newer. They're not brand new by any means, but they haven't always been part of HTML. Things like navs and mains and headers and footers. Speaking of footer, if we go down to the bottom of this page, we look at the footer here. It is a footer element. It's an actual footer. That's what it's called. Again, just like a div, but it tells us a bit about what it is. Now, if we look at the footer on Medium, it might be a footer element. Nope, it's just a div. So just looking at this markup, we really can't tell anything about what the content is. Versus over here, we at least have an overview of, all right, we've got a footer at the bottom, we've got a header, we've got a bunch of different sections, so we didn't really hit those yet, but if we look at one of these sections right here, whoops, click that, hover, that's a section of content. Scroll down, we've got another section right there. So instead of just using a generic div, a section makes sense. It's a grouping of content, it's a section of the page. So there are a bunch of these elements that I'm just going to cover pretty quickly because honestly there's nothing to them except for their different names. Header, footer, nav, section, article, main, they all behave just like divs except they have some meaning. So now the question is why? Why does it matter? So there are a couple of reasons. It all comes down to adding meaning to our markup, and that meaning could be meaning for other computers or for an application or a crawler like Google. If Google is writing code that's going to come across all of our markup, or let's say it comes across this markup here for Medium, it's very difficult for that code to quickly figure out, all right, what's navigation content? Where are all the links on this page? If a crawler is trying to find navigation links, often that's what they do. One of the strategies for crawling is just finding all the links in a nav bar or all the links in a footer and crawling those and continuing to visit those pages and do the same thing over and over. Now on this document, it's not immediately clear where the navigation content is. Versus here, well, I closed it, but as we saw, it was very easy because it's just called out with the actual element nav. Here's a nav for navigation content. So that's a simple example. The same thing goes for categorizing other pieces of your markup. There are semantic elements for things like even times and dates. There are elements. There's a time element. Code can understand what that is very easily. Instead of if you just had a generic span or a paragraph or something, it doesn't have any meaning. It doesn't explain anything about what it contains. So that's one reason, making your code more crawlable, more friendly to other applications or to other code. The second reason has to do with accessibility and making your code more accessible to people using screen readers, to people who cannot see the rendered content or may not be able to fully see it or might elect to use a screen reader. Those screen readers can look for things like a nav element or a header or a footer or an article, a main, a section. It can use those as hooks. They act as sort of signposts, which is really important because if you're reading this content, that's what a screen reader looks at or is reading out loud, it's just all of this stuff here. How is it going to know where the navigation links are? How will it know where the footer is? So if you're using a screen reader and you want to quickly go to the sign in or you want to go to the about page or you want to go to the careers page, if you're using a screen reader, you would hopefully be able to ask for the footer or the header, or you'd be able to quickly navigate there. And if you use these semantic elements, it makes that far easier. And I'll actually demonstrate that as a little bonus video in this section. And then the third reason that's important is that it just makes your own code, your markup, more navigable for yourself and for other developers. If I'm scrolling through this and I need to figure out, I need to update, the nav links, it's not immediately clear where to do that. Or if I need to update the footer, I've got to open up all these divs and try and figure it out. Versus here, if I need to update the footer, it's pretty obvious. I just look for the footer element, and there we go. So that one's not as important, but it is worth considering. So adding meaning into our markup is the idea behind writing semantic markup. There are a whole subset of elements in HTML which don't do anything that you couldn't do before. So they don't add new features or any new visual, I don't know. There's nothing new about them except that they add meaning to the markup. You use an article or a section or a main instead of div, div, div. So we'll play around with some of these elements up next. Okay, so we're going to take a look at some of these semantic elements and try using them. This will be quick, even though we're going to talk about quite a few elements, because, as I mentioned earlier, they don't really do anything different. They just have different names. Okay, so here are some of the examples of elements you could use in place of a div or just a generic container. We're going to begin with a main, or the main element, which is supposed to represent the dominant content of the body of a document. Basically, it should be the main content of your page, and it should exclude any content that would be repeated across the page. So things like, or that would be repeated across different pages, sidebars, nav links, copyright information, logos, search forms, that does not really pertain to the main content of a page. So, for example, on Wikipedia here, if we were to have a main, I would put it around the main content here. So not this nav bar, not this search, not this sidebar, but everything that has to do with the chicken main content, all this stuff. So you don't have to do this, right? It could just be divs, but that's where I would use a main. So I'll do the same thing here. Let's add a main element, and our website right now is just sort of garbage and doesn't have much meaning anyway, but let's say it ends all the way at the bottom. We don't have any sort of nav bar or anything yet, but we will shortly. Okay, so nothing changes, but we have now highlighted or written an element that explains, here's the main content. The next semantic element we'll look at is the nav. So the nav is supposed to represent anything on the page that provides navigation links. So that could be links to other parts on the same page, like we have on Wikipedia, right? These aren't links to go somewhere else. They're just taking me to a different part of the page, or it could be links to completely different resources. Both are just navigation links. So a nav is very simple. You just fill it with whatever content you want. It should contain links. For now, we haven't seen how to actually create, nice looking nav bars or anything like that. But if we wanted to just fake it and add a nice little nav here with some links, I would probably do an unordered list with some LIs and then an anchor tag. Let's just make this up. We'll do home, and let's do a couple of them. I just used that shortcut I mentioned a while back. And then we'll do what else? Instead of home, let's do about. So these won't actually go anywhere. Actually, I think we do have an about.html, don't we? And then, do we? Yep. So we could link to that. And then we could have a contact or something, which won't do anything either. But the point is here just to show you how we would use a nav element. So if I refresh, it looks just like LIs instead of a UL because that's all that it is. But now we have this wrapping nav that explains this is for navigational content. So it doesn't just have to be the top nav of a page. It could be any navigational links, as we saw in Wikipedia. It could be the sidebar, or here on MDN, I would assume this is a nav, and probably this breadcrumb right here that just shows us how we arrived where we are. If we actually inspect, we'll probably find that out. Let's see. Yep, so there's a nav right there, and I think there's a nav right here. Is there? Yep. So it doesn't have to be there, but they make sense to use. So that's all there is to nav elements. Screen readers will look for these and call them out, just like a web crawler would as well. Next up, we have the section element. The section element is still quite generic. It's just supposed to represent a standalone section of an application or of a website. It doesn't really say anything other than that, but it's still far better than a div. A div is just a generic container. You could use a div for anything. As we saw on that Medium website, a div was used to make a button. A div was used, this could be a div right here. This could be a div here. This whole thing could be a div. These could each be divs, but a section is really supposed to be a section of content, a standalone section of your website. And MDN says that it represents a standalone section which does not have a more specific semantic element. So you could use a section in place of a nav, just like you could use a div in place of everything, but a nav makes more sense. It's more meaningful or more specific. So what I would use a section for is probably on this markup, something like this right here might be a single section. I mean, it's kind of hideous, but that could be a section. And then this could be a section where we have a standalone section of content. We've got our heading, and then we've got a paragraph or two. And this could be a section, you'd have to figure out where you break it up. But if we go back to Wikipedia, I think it's a little clearer. This could be a section of content. And then this right here, maybe you do it for each chunk. So that's a section there. You don't have to, but it's just one option for dividing up your markup. And I'll do one example. Why don't we put a section in right around this H2? So section. And this paragraph just to here. So just keep it simple. I won't waste your time, but I would add these around every section of content if we want to section things off. Nothing looks different, but now this is grouped together as a section of our larger document. So you don't have to do that, but if you were going to group it in some way, like if I wanted to add a border or a different color, I would have used a div, but a section makes more sense. Next up, we have the article element, which represents a self-contained composition in a document. So this does not have to be reserved only for a newspaper article or a blog article. So you can see in the demo here, they consider this an article. on MDN. And in fact, there's actually multiple sub-articles. So you can have more than one article on a page. It's really just supposed to be any self-contained composition. So anything that should be independently distributable or reusable. So this could be something, this little weather widget that you might use across different websites. You've probably seen something similar before, where at least I see it all the time, where I get like on the newspaper or on a blog, I'll get a weather in my zip code widget from, I don't know if it's weather.com or Google Weather or whatever it is. So articles are just another element that we use to group content together. There are a couple of notes. There should be a heading that explains what the article is or what it's about. So you could have something like a film review article, and inside of that you could have a bunch of sections or even sub-articles. This can be a little confusing, and one of the hardest things about these semantic elements is that people use them differently. So I'm not trying to show you one way or one set of rules that you must follow. I just want to expose you to the fact that there is an article element, and you could use it, and I might use it on, if I was making Wikipedia, I might wrap all of this in an article. Not the sidebar, not the navbar or any of that, but the actual main content here. Another element is the aside. So an aside is supposed to be something that is not really part of the document. Well, it could be part of it, but it's not essential. It's indirectly related. It's tangential. It is not essential. So they're often presented as sidebars, call-out boxes. I would not be surprised if this was an aside. Let's inspect. Yeah, it is an aside. Well, when I open up, you probably saw that. When I open up the DevTools, there we go. It comes back. Okay. So it's a responsive site. It changes and reorders and resizes as the window changes. But there you go. We can see that is an aside. It's pretty much just like any of these other elements we've seen. You use them instead of a generic container. So the example on MDN is an article about salamanders. And then there's this little aside here that's just a note, a little bonus topic about the rough-skinned newt and its deadly neurotoxin. They actually live with me around here. They don't live with me in my house, but I see them all the time on my driveway. Very interesting creatures and very toxic. Then we've got header and footer, two of the more commonly used ones. They are kind of self-explanatory, I guess. The header element is supposed to be any sort of introductory content. It often will include navigational content as well, as we saw on Stripe, or if we go to Wikipedia. This whole thing up here could be a header. I don't think they use semantic elements, but if we look at Stripe again, you can see that up top, we do have the navigation area. I really like this little menu, by the way. It's very fancy JavaScript. But the header itself actually includes all of this. This is all introductory content. So it doesn't have to. It's totally up to you or up to the developers, but I think, it does include all of that content. And then we move on to our first main section of the site, and then another section and another section. So the header is the introductory content, and the footer is this whole thing down here. And both of them often will include links and navigations and navs that are nested. And along those lines, you can also put a header inside of other elements. So you could have an article element with a header inside of it and a footer. So you can have more than one footer on a page. Here's an example of a footer located inside of an article. It would look like this. Here's our footer for the article. And this could be on a web page. It actually is right now, where we have an actual footer, a typical footer at the very bottom. So there's a lot of flexibility. This isn't super rigid. Just keep in mind the general intent, the semantics of each of these elements. So we've got header and footer. If we wanted to put a footer in, I'll just do that for now. On this example, we don't really have much, but maybe at the bottom after our main, we can put our footer, and in here, I don't know, a paragraph. This is my website, and maybe a UL with an LI and an anchor tag, just gibberish, contact. And is there anything else we should put here? I don't know. How about help? So there's our footer at the bottom. Doesn't look like anything, but that is a footer element, and that's the sort of content we would put in a footer. And then we could put a header up top. It works exactly the same. So header, footer, and then I won't show examples of these, but there are a couple more elements. There are things like a time element. Now this one is actually a bit different. It is an inline element. You wrap it around some piece of content that represents a time or a date time or just a date. So you can see here There's a time element being wrapped around this July 7. There's another time around 2000, around 20 here. And it's being made bold through CSS, but that's not actually what the time element does. It's purely there to call something out as time in a machine-readable format, and you are supposed to specify this date time attribute. Not super important for now, but just know this is another semantic element. We've also got a figure element, which represents apparently a self-contained piece of content with an optional caption. So here is a figure, and it contains another element called a fig caption. So you could just use a div, as always, but a figure calls out some special meaning to this. It's usually an illustration, a diagram, something that you want to call attention to, and may often have a caption alongside it. So something like this could be a figure over here, or certainly that would. Now, I don't think Wikipedia does this, but it's just another element that you have at your disposal. So there are still others we have not talked about, the abbreviation element, the data element, but they're not that essential for now. Just keep in mind this concept of semantic elements, semantic markup, where instead of using generic containers, we can use things like a main and a nav. We can use a section. We can use a header and a footer to call out or to add meaning to the actual markup itself. This is useful for us as developers just to look at our code and immediately understand what's going on. It's important for screen readers and improving accessibility, and it's also essential for SEO. So I'd like to take a quick moment to talk about screen readers and actually demo one to you. I am in no way qualified to show you much. Screen readers are actually pretty complicated tools, and with good reason, right? People use them to navigate the web exclusively, or at least some people do. So they have a lot of features, tons of keyboard shortcuts. I can never remember them. And some of the people who use them a lot, I have a friend who uses a screen reader who turns the speed up so insanely fast that I cannot understand. Maybe I can get 1 out of every 20 words that the screen reader says when he's really going and using it. It's crazy. Anyway, I just want to show you the difference between using semantic elements and not using semantic elements. So I'm going to open up the screen reader. This is a built-in screen reader on a Mac. It's called VoiceOver. There's one that's built into Windows machines. There's also software you can download and pay for. But on a Mac, it is Command and then F5. Should pop up. Okay.
Heading level 4 link. Subscribe. No items in web spots menu. You are currently in the VoiceOver menu. Chrome has new window.
Okay. So now I've opened up the web spots menu, which is just going to show me the different elements on this page that sort of jump out, things that I could look at easily. And there's nothing
Articles
here.
Menu.
There are articles that are listed
Auto
here.
web spots menu.
Auto web spots, however this utility has decided on that.
Window spots menu, links menu.
And then all of the links on the page, of which there are quite a few. But what if I just wanted to get to this top nav or the bottom nav, or I wanted to get to the main content? It's not clear how to do that at all. Now let's compare that to Stripe's website, which, if you recall, does use semantic elements. It uses nav elements for navigation links. And it uses, what else? Header and footer. It uses a main element. Well, now I've got this new menu called
Landmarks.
Landmarks has navigation. So 3 different nav elements were used on this page, and I can quickly get to them. It also has the main element. So if I quickly wanted to get to the main content.
Navigation main link. NEW issuing is now available to all U.S. businesses.
If we look at all of the links on this page, which is what I was doing on the previous website on Medium, there are so many, it's just kind of overwhelming.
Visited.
I could scroll through them all. Wow. I mean, there's a lot of links on here. So seeing them all at once doesn't really help me. But if I go to the landmarks menu, I now can quickly jump. Do I want the navigation on the top or the bottom of the page? And then I can't even remember the shortcut to actually, is it enter?
Group. You are currently on a group. To interact with items in this group, press Control, Option, Shift, down arrow.
Control, Option, Shift, down arrow. No? Oh, come on.
Navigation.
Well, anyway, I'm already lost. You can see, though, hopefully you can see the difference. Just the fact that the VoiceOver utility can tell where navigation is on this page, where the main content is a huge improvement over what we had on Medium, where, as much as I love Medium, it just wasn't clear. Now, there probably are other tools and tips and tricks that real users of screen readers know, and maybe Medium is friendlier than I'm giving it credit for, or more accessible. But to me, with my very limited skill set using the screen reader, you can see that the semantic elements make a difference on a website like Stripe. So next up, we've got a little bit of an interlude. I'm going to focus on one of my favorite parts or features of VS Code. It's something called Emmet. I'm going to do my best to spread out some of these tips and tricks for VS Code throughout the course where they make the most sense. Emmet is a tool that works, or it helps us write HTML, so I'm introducing it now. Okay, so what does Emmet do? Emmet is an extension. It's actually built into VS Code, but it's something for other editors that you can download that helps us very quickly write HTML markup, where we don't have to type everything from scratch. We can use shortcuts. It does come bundled in with VS Code, so you don't have to install anything. And if you watch this demo on their website, we can actually see some pretty cool stuff. Something like this. This is quite complicated, and I don't know all of the syntax, but if you just run this, it will be expanded into a bunch of markup. So there is a lot of this syntax, this shortened syntax that you can use to create HTML elements quickly. There's a cheat sheet on the Emmet documentation. I'll show you a couple of examples. So if you wanted to make this structure right here, where we have a nav with a UL as a child and then an LI as a child of that UL, we use this right here, nav and then that greater than UL greater than LI, and then you hit tab. So this little piece of syntax makes a child element. So let's try it out. Why don't we make a new document or a new file here? I'll just call it Emmet demo.html. And let's use my little snippet there. This is actually from Emmet. You can see it tells me that. To get my basic structure, I'll change the title. Emmet demo. Okay. And then in here, why don't we try something like, let's say I want a main, and then I want a header inside of that, or maybe I want, how about a section with an H1 inside of that, and I'll hit tab. There we go. So that is the first little bit of Emmet syntax we've seen. You use that bracket there. Technically doing something like this is also coming from Emmet, just making an H1, but using that bracket is a nice little feature that makes child elements. Next up, we have the sibling plus sign. We can make two elements or more elements that are not nested, but they're siblings. So if I really quickly wanted, I don't know, what would we want here? How about an H1 and then an H2 after that, and then another H2? I could do this, and it makes them together. They're not nested. They are adjacent. They're siblings. We also have this thing called climb up. I'm going to ignore that for now, but it allows you to navigate. So you could make a div with a sibling of a div, and then a paragraph inside of that div, with a span inside of that paragraph, with an adjacent EM element. We have yet to discuss that. And then you can climb up to escape, sort of to go back to where you were and do a block quote. Anyway, you don't need to worry about that for now. This is, honestly, in my opinion, it's harder for me to remember all of the syntax. I most commonly use this, and this one over here, multiplication. So multiplication helps us make a bunch of things that are similar at once. If I needed to make a bunch of LIs inside of a UL, I could have my UL, and then inside I could have LI, and that will make a single one, or I can multiply it if I want 4 of them, just like that. So that's extremely useful, and I also find this numbering very useful. This one uses the $ syntax, and it's going to create numbers for us, so it will add them dynamically in. So I could do something like, maybe I'll make a nav, and inside of this nav, we have a UL. Inside of that, there's a bunch of LIs. And then I want 5 of those LIs, so I'll multiply by 5. And inside of each one, we want an anchor tag. So let's see what we end up with there. Okay, hopefully no surprises. Nav, UL, 5 LIs, each with an anchor tag. I just undid that. But now if I use the $ here, I could do something like, well, if I just type the $, you'll see what I end up with. Not really a valid element, but we end up with our numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. So I could use that somewhere. The syntax to set an attribute like href looks like this right here. Href equals, and then I could put $ there. And now we have href equals 1, 2, 3, 4. It's kind of odd to do that, but it's possible. We could do something like href equals www.$.com. And there we go, www.1.com.2.com.3. Maybe you won't need this right away, but it can be nice if you need those numbers. And once we talk about things like classes, you'll see that used here, class attribute. We've not discussed that. This is sometimes useful. So there's a lot you can do with these numbers, but that's all I'll show you for now. If you want to add text inside of something, a new element, you can do these curly braces. So you could do something like an anchor tag with click me inside. Well, that seems kind of easy to do. But what if you wanted something like, I want each one of these anchor tags to have something inside of it that says, I don't know, click me. Well, all I need is those curly braces, click me, and then expand that. And there we go. So this is what we end up with here. Click me is inside of each one of those anchor tags. Kind of a lot of syntax, and if you don't know what you're doing and you look at this, it's absolutely overwhelming. So what I think I'm going to do is actually write a comment so you can see what I expanded into that. And I'll do that for each of these. But definitely the most frequently used, at least for me, the most frequently used shortcuts are the, what is that, greater than bracket. So I can do, a UL with an LI inside. And then using the multiplication to make multiple elements. And then using the plus sign to make adjacent elements. Some of this stuff is nice, but you really I at least have to work to remember it, and sometimes it's just not worth it. Okay, so that's Emmet. It has to do with HTML, but it's not part of HTML. It's just a nice little tool that comes with VS Code. Hey everybody, welcome to the next section. This is our final section on HTML. HTML is a topic that will resurface throughout the entire course, but this is the final designated HTML section. We're really just talking about two important concepts, or two groups of elements. The elements that help us make tables. When I say a table, I'm talking about a data table, a two-dimensional table, and then the elements that help us make forms. So you might notice there's a decent chunk of yellow topics here, things that I've labeled or I've called out as taking a bit more time to understand, or a bit more time to fully explain to you. And they all have to do with tables, the first three. Tables consist of a lot of HTML elements. As you can see, table, tr, td, th,thead, tfoot, tbody. First of all, the names just kind of suck in my opinion, and they're hard to remember, easy to mix up. So that's why I've labeled them yellow. What is crucial out of the table elements is understanding the basics of making a table. I'll say that T-head, T-foot, and T-body are straightforward and easy, but they're not as crucial as the basics of a table. And then these two things that, will make no sense at this point in time, but call span and row span are nice to haves, and I wouldn't spend 1 second worrying about them if they confuse you in any way. Then we move on to forms. Forms consist of a lot of different elements working together, and obviously forms are important when we're making web apps. Any website you go to, almost every website, it's going to have some form of a form. Here's one right there, right? So these are important, and that's why it's under crucial. And like tables, they can take a bit more time to get comfortable working with, so I've made them yellow, or I've at least made this topic yellow here. Then for some of the other form-related topics, we have buttons. Those will be crucial. It's green, very easy to pick up. Labels, very important as well to understand. We'll talk more about accessibility and why labels are so important, but they go under crucial. Range and text areas, I'm going to say, honestly, somewhere between important and nice to have. Not a big deal. Two different types of inputs we can add to a form. They're important to know about, but they're not a deal breaker that will stop you from moving forward. Common input types, definitely important or crucial. And then form validations, for now I'll put under important. So the main takeaways that I would like for you to focus on in this section are the basic table elements. So don't worry about all this other stuff. And then the form basics. How do we make an HTML form and populate it with some common inputs? How do we label things? And how do we add buttons? So that's all coming up in this section. And it's the only thing that stands between us and the beautiful world of CSS. Okay, here we go. Welcome back, everyone. This is our last unit on exclusively HTML. We'll continue to use HTML, but this is really the last there's two big pieces here that are essential. The first thing we're going to talk about are tables, HTML tables, and then the most important thing we'll cover are HTML forms and a bunch of inputs and how we create modern accessible forms. So we're going to start with tables. We'll talk about when you should and shouldn't use tables, how they've been used historically, and a bunch of elements that we use to create tables. It can be a little crazy. Fortunately, tables aren't used all that often. But then we're going to spend the bulk of our time on the form element and a bunch of associated elements, different inputs and form controls and labels, so that we can define modern complex HTML forms with validations and that are accessible. They'll include things like labels and they'll follow best practices. Obviously, forms come up quite a bit in applications, whether it's an e-commerce website or a store, or even just anything with authentication, or even just a mailing list you want somebody to sign up for. Forms are everywhere. So we're going to cover them in this unit. But first, tables. So here we go. So we'll kick things off with HTML tables. So when we say table, we're referring to a data table, two-dimensional rows and column structure, right? Tabular data, usually a nice clear way of displaying some data. Not everything lends itself to a table. Here's a very simple one. We've got one row and two columns. I'm sure on MDN they have some slightly more complicated examples. Here's a much larger one on Wikipedia. This is a table, a tabular structure. We've got rows and columns. We have headers, and it's actually more complicated than just having headers. We have subheaders, or I'm not sure how you would want to call what you would call this, but we've got a header city proper that then has three types or three pieces of information within that one category. Same thing with urban area and metro area. Anyway, it's a much more complicated table. We have links inside. We've got a nice hover effect. That's all CSS there. We've got images. This is one example of a table. Still, it looks very tabular, table-y, not that attractive, in my opinion. But here's something that you might see. I was actually looking for a mattress recently, and I always try and find examples like this when I'm teaching. Here's an example of an actual table. This is, if we inspect, it's a table element to compare different mattresses on Casper in this case. And this is not an endorsement of Casper. I haven't gotten my mattress yet. I have no idea if it's any good or not. But anyway, you can see we have rows and columns. It's just been styled very differently, so it looks nicer, but it still is a table. And I can actually inspect and prove that. Here we are, table. Now, what goes in a table is a much longer topic. That's what we'll talk about in the next video, because there are quite a few elements. But before we do that, let's talk a bit about the history of tables. So back in the day, in the 90s, and probably into the early 2000s, tables were actually used to lay out websites. So when I say layout, I mean to move content or position content around, which is still honestly a little bit trickier than you might hope, but it's way better now than it used to be. So back in the 90s, it was difficult to move something to the top, or to have three elements, split space, or to have text over here and two buttons next to each other, and then a bunch of this text down on the bottom. Whatever the layout is, it was not that easy. So tables were used, and there are a few examples of this still. This is the old Bob Dole 96 campaign website. I'm amazed some of these things are still up. And if you look at it, this right here, actually I think all of this might be a table. This is not a great use of a table anymore, and it's not something that you really should do. Tables should be reserved for tabular data, for rows and columns of information that you're trying to display in a tabular format, not just to lay out your content. But here we go. This whole thing is a table. Same thing with this lovely old Space Jam website. This whole thing right there, that is a table. And then within that table, we have a bunch of elements that we have yet to discuss, but developers like to use them back in the early days of web design, because you could make a bunch of cells and make them take up dead space in between. As you can see here, right, there are some empty cells and space in each cell. Each one has a width and a height, and it's very janky, but it did work and still works. It's just not best practice these days. So these days we should use tables for things like this or this here, where we're actually showing information that lends itself to the tabular format. So that about wraps it up for this intro. Tables, rows and columns, they used to be used to lay websites out. You shouldn't do that anymore. And the last point that you'll soon see is that there are quite a few different elements that can go into a table. We're going to go over them. You don't need to memorize or remember all of them, but I'm just going to show them all to you. That's coming up next. All right, so we're going to begin by defining our very first table. Now, remember what I mentioned previously. There are quite a few elements that go into a table, or that we can use in a table. But don't panic. You don't need to know them all at once. We'll introduce them as we go. So you can see some of them here. We've got the table element, which is where we'll start. And then in this video, we'll focus on the first three, or the first four, TD, TR, and TH. So we're going to make a table that displays the heaviest living bird species, basically just some of this information from Wikipedia. I'm not going to copy every single piece because it's kind of annoying, but we'll just do probably the animal name, the average mass in kilograms and pounds, and then maybe if it's a flighted bird or not. Okay, so the first thing we need to do is actually add a table element. And here's the MDN page for the table elements. It represents our tabular data, but itself, the element itself, does very little unless we put something inside of it. So I'm going to make a new document here. I'm going to make this one called, how about just birds, heaviest birds.html. And then I'll do my shortcut here with Emmet, the exclamation point. Then we'll do heaviest birds table. And then in here, why don't we put a little heading in here, heaviest birds, and then a table, just like that. So I'll open this up in my browser. I'm working in a new folder now, right? I've broken up into different sections. So we're in this one right here, and heaviest birds.html, or you could just double click on your file, drag it to the browser, and here we are. There is a table element here, but there's nothing to see. So now we need to cover the elements that go inside of a table. And there are three we're going to focus on for now, the TD, TR, and TH. I personally hate the naming there. That's one of the worst parts of working with tables and teaching them, is that it just is it's a little confusing at the beginning. So a TD, that's where we're going to begin. It stands for table data cell or table data. I don't really know what the D is for. It represents a single cell. I would have called it a TC or just maybe a cell, just 2 extra characters. So TD defines a single cell in a table that contains data. So this could be a TD, that one could be one, this could be one, this could be one, and hopefully you get the picture. Let's see how it works. Let's go look at our list of largest birds or heaviest living birds. And let's just do a single, how about ostrich for one of our cells, and then I'm not going to copy this exactly, so I'll do average mass of 104 kilograms, 230. Okay, so let's just do a TD for now that says ostrich, and then we'll come back and worry about the headings in a moment. So then we'll do another TD, and what was it, 104 kilograms and 230 for pounds. Okay, so we have 2 table cells, or TDs. If I refresh, this is what we see. Not particularly spectacular, but it is working. We don't have borders turned on. We don't style anything, so it doesn't look great, but it is valid. So if I wanted to add in, how about just flighted as our final column, and I'll just have no. Refresh, we now have 3 cells. So now if I want to add in the next entry, which we have a Somali ostrich, 90 and 200, no, I'm just trying to remember that for myself. So I could do another TD, Somali ostrich, and then would we have 90 kilograms and 400? No, 200, okay. 200 pounds. That's pretty massive. 230 pounds is the average ostrich weight. And then one more, it's not a flighted bird. Well, if I refresh this, not quite what I wanted. We just ended up with a bunch of cells. Each one is a cell, but they're all on the same line. They're all in the same row. So what we need to do is actually use another element called a TR. A TR stands for table row, and it's a pretty easy one. It represents a row of cells in our table. So then we establish the cells with a TD, or soon we'll see TH. But the row is what groups elements or groups cells into a row. So this is one row here, this is one row there, and that's another row. And this is technically a row up top too. It's a row of headers. So all we need to do is wrap each one of these in a TR. And if we actually take a look right now, the browser went ahead and automatically added in a TR. They're all in a single row. We don't want to rely on that. It's not a very good table. So we will group our things together. Here's our first row. And then here is our second row, if I can format this correctly, right there. Okay, so we've got a table with 2 rows, and each row has 3 cells right now at least. Refresh, and now they're each their own row. Looks pretty good. Well, I shouldn't say it looks good, but it works. Let's see what happens if I add in, how about maximum mass for one of them, which is, I'm just going to copy this. So for the ostrich, not the Somali ostrich, if I just added another TD right there in the middle and I refresh, okay, well now we have 4 elements, 4 rows up top, or 4 cells up top and 3 down below, but now things don't align anymore. So we have name, we have average mass, and then this is maximum, and then we have flighted, if it's a flighted bird or not, but these don't align anymore. So there are a few things I could do if I wanted to have this no line up over here, or I want them to be part of the same column. Really what I could do is just add in another empty TD if I needed to. And there we go. We just don't have a value here, but usually we'll just want a value anyway for maximum mass, so I'm just going to copy that over. So that's 130,287. Okay, so now the biggest problem we have is that it's really unclear what the heck this is and what this is and why we're just saying no and no. What's going on? We need to add in some table headings or headers, and that is where our next element comes in, the TH. So the TH element defines a header, and that's all we need to know for now. We do put our headers inside of a row still. We still need to say, all right, here are 3 headers if we're going to have 3 columns. So for our example, we have 1, 2, 3, 4 different cells across each row, and then we're going to want 4 THs. So I'm going to do this right here, TR, because we want a row, and then our first header will just be, is it name? Yeah, we're going to ignore rank, so just animal. And if I just start with that, you'll see we get our header. Animal. It's by default, it's bolded. You can change all of that, just like pretty much anything with CSS. We can alter background color, sizes, fonts, spacing, borders, everything. So we have animal, and then average mass. I'm just going to copy this. And then maximum mass, so another TH. And this one right here, maximum mass. Let's see what that looks like. Okay, so it spreads out quite a bit now. And then we've also got, what was our last one? Flighted. So let's do that. A TH, is the bird flighted or not? And now we have our 4 table headers in a row, and then our 2 rows below that, where each one has 4 table data cells or TDs. So it's definitely a bit cluttered because of how long these headers are and how tight everything is. But this is a valid table. Let's quickly add in one more row at the bottom. So TR. And do we have a flighted bird that I could include? I do like cassowaries. But where's the first flighted bird? Domestic turkey or wild turkey. Okay. So I'm just going to copy these. This is not in order necessarily. So wild turkey is our name, and then the average mass, the maximum mass, and they are flighted, barely. But there are wild turkeys that live in my yard, and they live in a tree up there, and it shocks me, but they can fly up there. They're pretty big. Nothing compared to an ostrich, but still pretty big. 30 pounds, 90 pounds. Okay, so there's our table. We've got our table element. We've got TRs. Here's a TR, another one, and another one. And then our top row consists of 4 THs for the headers. And then our bottom 3 rows are a bunch of table data cells, TDs. So this video is just the basic intro to tables. Next up, we have a couple other elements to add into this mess, and then we'll move on to forms. In this video, I'm going to introduce 3 pretty straightforward elements that we add to section off our table. We have T-head, T-foot, and T-body. So these don't really do much except break up your table into logical sections where we can tell this is the header, this is the footer, and this is the body of the table. This is the main data of the table in the case of the body. This would be the set of headers. And you often won't have footers on a table, but you might, for example, if you have totals or other information at the bottom that is not really part of the main data set, but it's cumulative or an average or something at the bottom. So all we do is wrap our rows with a T-head or T-body or T-foot. So I don't think we have a good use for a T-foot on this table, but we do have T-head right here, wrap that around our row of headers. And we could have more than one row of headers. For example, this table I showed earlier of the largest cities in the world, we've got 2 rows of headers, if you can see that here. Definition, population, area, that all is under city proper, and then we have population and area for metropolitan area and urban area. So these over here are actually 2 rows tall. City, country, skyline, UN 2018 population estimate, and then this is one row, and so on. So this all should be wrapped in a T-head element to make it clear that this is all the header of the table, or headers, and then this is the body of the table all the way down to the bottom. I don't think there's a foot. So let's go add our table body. I guess before, let's just refresh and you'll see nothing changes. And then I can add my T body right there. I will cut that and paste it down after my last row. So this is important both just to write nice semantic markup and easy to understand tables, also for accessibility purposes, especially if you have complicated tables. Tables are just not very accessible in the first place. They are a pain to access using a screen reader, but in general, you want to follow best practices, and if you do have a table, especially a more complicated one, designate the table head and the table body, and the foot if you have one. The last thing we'll see with tables for now is how we can create these headers, or any cells really, that span multiple columns or multiple rows. So in this table, we've got some of these headers that are 2 rows tall: city, country, skyline, population estimate, and then here we've got one row, but we've got elements, we've got headers that are 2 columns, or in this case, 3 columns wide. So I'd like to make a second table, probably slim it down. So I'm just going to copy our table here. And down here, maybe I'll just put an H2 or something to separate them. For now, I'll just write V2. And we're just going to bother with the animal name, the average mass, and the maximum mass. We'll get rid of maximum mass. So it'll just be those 3. But I am going to need to remove the maximum mass cell from each one of these. Okay, so here's our beginner first step of this table. And I'd like to have 2 columns, one for kilograms and one for pounds, instead of combining them. So I want kilograms and then pounds, and I want them both to have a shared header like we have here. So I want it to say average mass and then kilograms, pounds. So to do this, I'm going to start by making 4 TDs in each one of these. So we had 104 here for kilograms, and then 230 for pounds. And then I'm going to do the same thing. So 200 here, and then 29.8 will go right there. Okay. Now we only have 3 headers at this point. So I'm going to redo my headers now so that we just have kilograms, and then below that we'll have pounds. But what I want to do is have a header above them that says average mass. And if I'm losing you, we're following this pattern here. So we'll have kilograms, pounds, average mass on top. So to make this work, we need to use 2 attributes we have not yet seen, called col span and row span. Okay, so all that we need to do is make 2 rows of headers. So we're going to have 2 TRs. And in our top row, we're going to have animal. We'll have a new header that's not there yet, and flighted. So I'm going to move things around. We've got animal. I'm going to move these 2 THs down here. And this should start making sense in a bit. And then I'm going to add a new TH in here that just says average mass. So right now this is a problem. We have 5 equally sized THs. This is not really what we want, right? What I want here is to have animal take up 2 full rows in height. So this whole thing would be animal. I want average mass to take up 1 row in height, but I want it to go 2 columns across. So let me show you how this works. On animal, we can set row span to be 2. So now animal should take up 2 rows, and there we go. Its height is 2 rows. 1 row here, 1 row there. So I can do the same thing for flighted, which is what I want. Okay, still a little bit messed up because we need to say that average mass is spanning 2 columns. So col span equals 2. Refresh, and there we go. So it's still pretty ugly, but now what we've done is created 2 rows of headers. Some of the headers here, like animal, if I actually inspect, it might be easier to see. It takes up 2 full rows. This takes 2 full columns going horizontally, and that takes up 2 full rows. And then down below we have another row, and it really is just kg and lb, kilograms and pounds. They each are sort of one by one row by one column, like a typical header. So we can use those attributes to manipulate things, to resize, and to have different headers or even different cells that span across, not just a single row or a single column. It can be a little confusing, so just play around with them, but honestly, you're not going to need to do that very often. It's more important that we move on to forms, so don't get hung up on those 2 attributes. Okay, here we go, forms. Next up, we get to talk about one of the most important and useful elements. It's really a collection of elements in HTML, which is forms. Forms are all over the place, and in the next few videos, we'll learn how to create them. In this video, we're going to focus on the form element. So the form element itself doesn't really show up as anything at all. It's more of a shell or a container that will contain a bunch of individual form controls like text inputs and password inputs and buttons and checkboxes, but we group them together in a form. You can kind of see this on the diagram on the left side. The thick red border would be the form. It is a container. By the way, this border is not supposed to actually be on the website. I added that in after the fact. Anyway, that would be the form, and then the pink boxes represent individual controls or individual inputs. So, here's an example of a form, a nice looking form. We've got different inputs to type in an email, a full name, a password, right? And this is a different type of input. We get these dots. You've almost certainly seen that before, versus this input here where we get text, and you can see what I'm typing. We've got a button as well, although it's disabled right now. Here's another example of a form. This is a website called The Athletic. Very good sports journalism. Anyway, we've got a form here with a collection of inputs. Text input, text. This is an email input, which is very similar to text. We'll learn more about that. And then a password input where you can't see what you're typing. And then we also have this right here. This is something called a radio button, where I can select one from a group of things, in this case, just 2 different subscription plans. But forms are also simpler. Here's a simple form on Reddit, the search form up top. If I want to search for something, like my favorite type of silky chickens, I type it into this element here. This is a text input, but there is a form that surrounds it. There's a container. And if I inspect, you'll actually see that. There's a lot of stuff here, but I'll try and highlight it for you. Form, right there. This form element is what makes, it's one of the things that makes this all work. So the form element is what we're going to focus on for now. It's the container, the box, the thing that all of your inputs are put inside of. They're grouped together. But it's not just about grouping content together just to have it grouped for no reason. The form element also dictates where the form data should be sent when the form is submitted. So we can specify, send this data from the form to my server, or send it to, I'll show you a demo. We could send data to Reddit server if we wanted to. We can send data, I won't say wherever, but we have a lot of flexibility. And that form element, the parent form element we define that we wrap around everything else, that element is where we specify how the data should be sent and where. So before we go on, I will make a new form or a new HTML page called forms.html. I'll do my standard exclamation point tab. Let's go with forms demo here, and I'll put an H1 that just says forms or forms demo or something like that. And I'm going to open this up in my browser if I can get there. So I'll just hit back here, forms.html. I'm just viewing the folder that it's inside of. But again, double click the file on your desktop or wherever it is, or drag it into the browser. And I'm going to add my first form. So if I just type form and hit tab with Emmet, we get our opening and closing tag, and we get this empty attribute called action. We're going to focus on that pretty much right now. But first, I just want to show you, if I make this empty form and I refresh, we don't see anything at all. It's an empty container. But this action attribute is very important. It specifies where the data should be sent when the form is submitted. So this diagram on the left is my best attempt at illustrating this. It is a box. That's the form itself is the container, and it has a label on it that says send this data to myserver.com, or send it to /search, or whatever the URL is, some destination to send the information to. at this point, all we know is basic HTML. We don't know how to create a server and how to deal with form data and JavaScript and all of that. But we have to start by just explaining this so that when we get to those topics, it will make a bit more sense. So what we can do is piggyback off of somebody else's server. For example, on Reddit, this form, this search form here that I showed you, has an action attribute already set, /search. So if you look at the URL we're currently on, it's reddit.com/r/chickens. Now, when I submit this form, and let me just hit enter to do that, watch the URL. Notice here it says /search. That is the destination for this form data. It is this label. Send this data to /search. So I'm going to hit enter. I have Silky typed in here. And notice where we went, where we are, reddit.com/search. Now, there's also this thing at the end. We'll learn more about how or what this is. It says Q equals Silky, which is exactly what I typed in here. If I type something else, like a different type of chicken, let's do Polish chicken, and I hit enter, you can see that's showing up in the URL as well. Polish chickens, by the way, are very funny looking, adorable. Anyway, you can see though that that action /search is where the form took us to, and it also submitted the information, the form data. In this case, it's a very simple form. There's one input, just this one text input, and it takes that piece of information and sends it. But there are more complicated forms that have definitely far more inputs, and all that data will be sent together via an HTTP request. So even though we haven't learned a ton about HTTP requests, let's go through this process one more time and talk about what's actually happening behind the scenes. So we've got that form. We already have seen it has this action set to /search. And if I type something in, let's just go with Silky again, and I hit enter to submit that form, an HTTP request will be fired off to /search. Now, /search is not a website I can just go to, right? This is relative to where we currently are, which is reddit.com. So it's going to go to reddit.com/search. It's basically sending a request to a Reddit endpoint to /search, and then it's passing in our data right there. Q equals Silky. So Reddit server realizes, this is the job of a server, oh, you're asking for /search and you provided me the query of Silky. Well, let me go search my database, or probably a bunch of databases. Let me go find the images and the results and all the posts that I need to combine into this web page. And then I'll send the web page back to you, which is what it did. It sent this web page back, and we're viewing it here. So it's just sending a request in the same way that I could forego this form entirely. I could go to this URL myself and say, instead of Q equals Silky, how about Q equals, I don't know, chocolate. And what will I see here? I just searched Reddit for chocolate without actually typing into the form myself. It's not a very UI or a user-friendly way of doing it, but it's the exact same mechanism. The form is just a way to get here, at least in this situation. So we'll learn a lot more about forms and submitting them once we actually have somewhere to submit them to. Right now, we don't really. We're just using Reddit as an example. So we haven't learned a whole lot about HTTP and how these forms work and how we handle them, but remember that when you submit a form, a HTTP request will be sent. And we control where that request goes to using this attribute called action, and we control which type of HTTP method. You really don't need to care about that right now, but I need to mention it. We control that using an attribute called method. So if we look at this form, it has action search, method equals get. So the two terms you may hear are get and post. Those are two values for an HTTP method. But for now, let's just do the Men in Black memory erase thing. Don't worry about that. I just wanted to mention it. Once we get to handling forms, that will make more sense. Okay, so we can make our form. I can give it an action. Let's say anything really, but I could do /tacos. We're not going to see anything at all until I put some stuff in here, which is what the next video will be about. What goes in a form, or what can go in a form. There are lots of options, but all you need to remember for now is that the form acts as this thing that groups together inputs and then submits them together to some specified destination with a little shipping label. Okay, so next up, we'll start with some inputs. Okay, so now that we've seen the form container element, the wrapper element, let's talk about what goes inside, or what can go inside a form. The most common element, the most common form control, though there are some others we'll cover, is the input element. So the input element is extremely versatile. We can use it to make 20 plus different inputs. So that could range from a checkbox to a color picker to a date picker to a password input to just a plain old text input. And the way that this works, it's the exact same element, input, but we change one attribute called type. And type is going to dramatically alter how it behaves. So I'll show you some examples. Here is the input documentation on MDN. The first thing you should know is that input is another example of an element that does not have a closing tag. There's no content between two tags. So if you look at how we use it, scroll down a bit more. It's quite the long page. Here you go. Here's an example. Just input. There's no closing tag. There's no content in between. And the most important attribute, as I've mentioned, is this one called type. But before we do that, let's head over to our HTML document, forms.html. I think my cat stepped all over my keyboard. Let's delete all of that. We've got our empty form, and let's add a single input, just like that. So technically this is a valid input, even though we didn't specify what type. I believe it defaults to a text input. As you can see here, I've got a text input, and that's part of my form. Now, what I'm usually going to do is specify type equals text. It's a lot clearer what we're working with. We won't really notice a difference at all. It's still a text input. But now let's play around with a couple different types. So I'm just going to duplicate this a couple different times. We have text as our first one. Why don't we try, how about password? That's another very common input where the text inside is actually obscured. So password, we'll refresh. And this second one is our password input. This one is our text input. So I'm sure you've seen these quite a bit in the wild. We just took a look at one earlier. It's exactly the same element, just one difference in the type attribute. So why don't we take a look at something even more different? How about, let's go with a color input. So let's do that here. Type equals color. Probably won't use this one very often, but this gives us a color picker. Look at that. By the way, the color picker itself and the inputs will probably look different depending on the browser you're using. You can style these, you can change them, but the browser has some defaults for what they look like. So there's a color picker. What else? We're not going to deal with file pickers at the moment. We've got a month input. Don't use that very often. A number input. So this is just like a regular, or it looks like a text input, except I can't type letters in here. I can type numbers, and I can use the arrow keys. I'm hitting up and down arrow to increment and decrement my number, and I can click on this right there, do the same thing. So let's get one of those going here. Number, refresh. There's our number inputs. And let's also do, how about time? You can do that. So time picker, you can also type the time in there yourself. We've got a week input. I don't think I've ever used that in my life. And we'll come back and talk about some of these odder ones like a radio and a range and a checkbox. Not that they're odd in a bad way, they're just different. I'm going to cover those in a separate video. I'll group them together. So that's the basic idea of input. Very versatile. I mean, 4 pretty different types of inputs already, and that's just a small subset of them. But there are other attributes aside from this type attribute that we should cover. And one of the most important is something called placeholder. Placeholder is an attribute that will specify the placeholder text for an input, which is the text that shows up before we've typed anything or while it's empty. So for my text input, what is this input supposed to be? Let's say it's a username. I want you to type your username in. I'll refresh, and we see username, but then as soon as I type, my content wins, and we don't see the placeholder. So it's just a placeholder. Now, it doesn't work for every single input. For example, a color input, I don't think you can add a placeholder. On a password input, it is helpful just to specify this is password, or you can do something like enter your password. It just shows up there until you start typing. And we've got a number input, same thing, placeholder equals, enter a number. And there you go. Okay, So placeholder, very important, just in terms of making sure people know what to type into your inputs. However, it's still not super accessible, and we don't have something that we definitely need, which are labels. We will talk about that in the next video, how we properly label these inputs, and there's a couple of reasons why that's important. But for now, what we've seen is that using just one input element and changing that one type attribute, we can get quite a variety of different types of inputs or different form controls. Okay. So the next essential HTML form element is the label. Now the label is easy to write off. I've seen a lot of beginners say, it seems like it's not super necessary, but labels are really, really important in terms of accessibility and making your forms just easier to use. So here we have a checkbox, which we actually haven't seen how to create just yet. And then we have a label. Now this label does more than just visually give us some text. It also is associated with this checkbox. So they are linked behind the scenes. So if someone's using a screen reader, the screen reader knows exactly what text belongs with this. Otherwise, if a label was not used and we just had a paragraph or a span or some other text, it would be basically impossible for the screen reader to know, does this text go with that checkbox, or does this text, or how is it organized? So the label element actually associates. There's a direct connection between some input or some form control and some piece of text. Also, it's not just about enhancing this for screen readers or making a better experience for people using screen readers. It also makes the label itself clickable when we associate two elements. So I can click here to select the checkbox or to uncheck it. And that can be nice for everyone, but especially on smaller screens or people with poorer vision. It's just easier. So those are some of the reasons to use labels. We need to usually have some sort of label for our inputs, even if it's not an actual label element. You might be able to get away with, something else, a span or a paragraph, but you shouldn't, because a label gives you additional benefits. So the way we make this connection from a label to an input is by using two attributes we have not seen. One is called ID. So on an input, we give it an ID. It could be anything. It should be short and simple, but in this case, it's cheese for this one checkbox. Then we use that exact same value and we set it for the for attribute on the label. So what does this label, or what is it for? It's labeling something called cheese. And that basically matches anything that has the ID of cheese. IDs are something we'll come back to when we learn CSS in just a bit. But what you should know now is that only one element on a page should have a given ID. So cheese is supposed to be unique for this one input. We could have cheese 2 or peas or some other ID. We can do whatever we want, but we should not reuse cheese. And that's important because this is labeling exactly one input. There's one connection, cheese and cheese. Okay, so let's go ahead and add a label for this form. Let's see, what should we do? Let's pretend that this is a, I guess, what do we have? A username, a password, a color, and a number. Well, let's just go with enter a username, enter your password, or something like that. So let's do that here. We'll add our first label. So a label has an opening and closing tag. Inside we put the text that we want to label the input with. So let's go with enter a username. Okay. And then we need to associate that label with this input. So why don't we let's do the ID first on our input. So what should the ID be? ID will be, how about just username? That's exactly what it is. It's a username input. Then here on the label, we set for equals username, and those need to match. Let's refresh. So now we have our text. Notice the label is an inline element. So if we want to break our form up, that's totally up to us. I mean, we could use divs or paragraphs or anything really to structure this. But now, as I click here, can you see that my input was focused automatically for me? That tells us they are associated. And if I change that, if I got rid of, or I just slightly misspelled something, I got rid of an E, they're no longer connected. And I click here, nothing happens. So that proves to us that they are connected. There is that link behind the scenes. So we should add a label in for each one of these. You can do that quickly. And if you use Emmet, you do label tab, it automatically adds the for attribute. So we could do password, and then let's just go with enter a password. And why don't we wrap these guys in a paragraph? So we want that to be a paragraph to start. Let's see how that looks. It looks pretty awful, but it's good enough for now. Let's do another paragraph for the password and the password label. Okay, and then let's connect them. So for equals password, we need ID equals password. That should be good enough. Let's see if they're connected. There we go. And it is a password input. Now we've got our color. Could do that too. Probably not that common to need this, but let's label it. Color will be the for attribute. ID needs to be color, and enter a color. Refresh. I click on this label and it is associated. It opens up the color picker. And finally, we've got our number. We'll just do a label here. For will be number. ID will be number. And lastly, our text will be enter a number. I have no idea what this form is where we need, let me associate them. Not associate them, let me group them together in this paragraph. Okay, there we go. And now we've got a lovely form that you can't submit because we don't have a button, but all the labels are set up correctly. And this is super important that you follow this pattern. So if you're just making a form quickly on your own, I can understand it's easy to skip labels, but if you're ever going to have something released to the world and deployed and you want people to use it, it's going to be in your portfolio, whatever it is, make sure your inputs are labeled correctly. Now there is one other way to label an input using the label element. It's less common, but you can do this where you actually will nest the input inside of the label. Like this right here, the input is nested inside of the label. Technically, you don't have to have the for and the ID if you do it this way. So this is a valid approach, but for some reason, it's far more standard and common to do it this way, to not nest them. And I guess it makes it easier to style things separately. This way, they're kind of implicitly linked. It's better, in my opinion, to go with this route, even though this is easier and a bit shorter. This is what I'll be using. So we use an ID and the for attribute labels. Very important. I'll leave off at that. Let's move on. We got to talk about buttons. Next up, let's talk about buttons. So buttons are pretty important to your typical web page, whether they're in a form, which is super common, right? We've got a button here to create an account, a PayPal button, a Google button, an email button. Those are all buttons. But also, we often will just have buttons that don't necessarily exist inside of some form. This login button, a sign up button, join, these may actually be links masquerading as buttons thanks to CSS, but it's pretty common to have buttons, right? Up arrow, down arrow, those are all some form of a button, or they look like a button at least. So there's an element, surprise, surprise, called button. And button has an opening and closing tag, and whatever text we put inside of it will be used to label the button. And just like all of these other inputs that we've seen, these different form controls, each browser has some default styling, but you can change that. So the button that you're going to see right now is not the permanent button that you'll be stuck with. You can change it once we get to CSS. So why don't we add a button at the end of the form that says, submit or something. That's all we need. Button, closing tag, and then some text inside. Refresh, and there's my button. It says submit. Okay, so now let's talk about what this button does. If I click this button, what's going to happen here? Oh, what happened? It took me to /tacos. Why am I at /tacos? Well, that is the action of my form, and /tacos just does not exist at the moment. It's not being found. File was not found. It's looking for a file called /tacos. It doesn't exist, but it's taking me there. It's sending a request because I am submitting the form. When I have a button in a form and I don't explicitly say this should not submit the form, it is going to submit the form. So I could make a couple of buttons. I'll put one up here and it says, please do not submit the form. I'll put one in the middle. Submit, how about I'll just say in the middle. So I've got 3 different buttons. One has the text of submit and it submits the form. One says, please do not submit. It also submits the form. And then the middle one says in the middle and it submits the form. Now, if I move these outside of a form, or if I just make a button up top, outside form, if I can spell correctly, outside form, this is not in the form, it does nothing. I can use JavaScript to make it do something once we get there, but at the moment it's not submitting a form, it doesn't do anything. So if you have a button inside of a form, the default behavior will be to submit that form. But we have an option. We can pass in an attribute called type, just like the type attribute for input, but we have different options or different values. So what I can do is set type equal to button. And this tells the browser, I want this button to behave just like a button. I don't want it to be a submit button, but just a regular old button that won't do anything. So I'm clicking it and it no longer submits the form. The default when a button is inside of a form is for it to submit. So if I change it back to that, it submits the form. Or I could just leave it off. But if you want a button inside of a form that does not actually submit the form, you can set its type to button. But that's not that common, at least not until we get to JavaScript. There are times you may want this. Okay, so that is one option. One other thing that you will see sometimes, although I'm not a big fan of it, is an input with the type of submit. And this is kind of it's not a bad way at all, but it's an odder way to make a submit button like we have here. Just going to comment that button out. You'll see we have two buttons and they both look identical, at least right now they do. This one came from the input type submit. This one came from button. And the reason I don't like this is that it's an input, which means there's no closing tag. And if I want to change that text on the regular button, I could change it very easily. I can add 3 exclamation points. It's right there. With this input, I didn't decide on this text, but I can change it. I just have to use an attribute called value, and I could do something like click me. But it's an attribute this time instead of quotes, and it's just a little clunkier, but it does work. So that's another option. I'll go ahead and write up some comments here so you can see the different types. All right, so I added some comments. We've got this button with type of button. It won't submit even though it's in the form. We've got this button with no type, but the default is to submit the form when it's inside of a form. And then we have input type equals submit. It also submits the form, but I don't like the syntax as much. And then lastly, I added a button outside of the form just to show you that there's no default behavior. It's acting just like a regular type equals button, not type equals submit. It won't submit any form. It does nothing. Okay, so that's buttons. Obviously very important to be able to submit a form. So next up, we're going to talk a bit more about what happens when we do submit. What's happening here and where's our data going? Next up, a really important attribute for inputs called name. So when we send data, when we submit a form, like this search form here, that says Silky, that's what I'm searching for, and I hit enter, we've already seen what happens. It submits the form. By the way, there's no button here, but we'll talk about how the submission works in a little bit without that. But when I do submit it, it sends an HTTP request to the form action, which is /search, as we already discussed, and then it sends the data, and it says Q equals Silky. Where is Q coming from? Why does it put Q equals Silky right there? Well, that's coming from the name of the input. If we look at it closely, here's the input. It has, ignore the class and the ID. It's got a placeholder. It says search, although my text is in there. But it has this right here, name equals Q. So that Q is simply a name or a label, although I guess the term label is confusing because we have an actual label too. But this is just a way of referring to the value, whatever is in this input, when the data is sent to the server. So often these are short, they don't have spaces, they're just simple things that your server will look for. In this case, Reddit is looking for something called Q. But they could have been looking for something called query or term or search term or anything else. And then they would change this name. So let me show you how this works on our own inputs. Right now we are submitting to /tacos, which is problematic because it doesn't exist. But if I do add a name to any of these inputs, but let's do the username input, just set name equals, and this can be really anything we want. I usually just go with username if that fits. If that's what this is, why not? Let's do the same thing here. I guess we can just start with username actually. So now if I put something in there like Chicken Man and I submit the form, I don't know if this is going to show up very well in the screencast. I'll paste it over here so you can see it. This is what we submitted, or this is the request that was made. Tacos, okay. And then this question mark thing, username equals Chicken Man. Whatever this is right here, that is the name that will be used to send the data to the server. So think of it as a pair. We've got the name and then a value. Something equals something. So if I change that name to instead be password, which would make no sense, it would be very confusing for some eventual server if we had something expecting a username and a password, and I entered my username, Colt, and I submit, well, it's saying password equals Colt, and it's just going off of that name. So those names are important, and you'll see them all the time on forms if you look at them. For example, if we look at one of these, what do we have here? The Stripe form, if I inspect it, I'm sure there's a name attribute. Geez, a lot of stuff going on, but here's name set to email. And for full name, what do they have? Name equals name. They just call it name instead of full name. Same thing for password. I assume they just call it password. Name equals password. So this attribute is easy to add, but it plays a very, very important role. At the moment, it may not seem that important because we're not doing anything with our form data, but eventually we will be. And this name attribute will be used when our data is sent. It will be labeled under this name. So username, let's do one here. Name equals password. Here we could do name equals color. And name, what is this input supposed to be? I don't know. For a number, name equals, how about just num? Okay, so now if I go back and I submit my form, I'll put something in here. Username is Colt. Password will just be 1234. Color, we'll just go with some reddish color, and a number will be 76. I'm going to submit, and there's quite a lot going on up here. I'm going to copy this, and we really don't need to understand what this is exactly right now, but we've got /tacos, that's coming from the action. Then we have username equals Colt. That was exactly what we had for our name here, and the value was Colt in the input. Then we have this ampersand. This is how the different pairs are connected into one URL. And then we have password equals 1234, color equals, you might be wondering what this is here. Well, technically the color looks like this. This is getting a little bit into the weeds, but it looks something like this where it has a hash symbol or an octothorpe, but instead of that, it's using an encoded version. Let's not even go into it. And then we have num equals 76. Long story short, name is important. You should put it on every single input that you use, and it will be used when you send your data to a server eventually. And the last thing I'll mention is, yes, right now our data is showing up in the URL, which could be problematic, right? We don't want our password to be in the URL. But that's because we're sending what's known as a GET request, and later on we'll see that there's different types of requests, HTTP requests, including a POST request, where that data will not be in the URL, and it will be sent, it's not necessarily in a secret way, but in a less obvious or less visually obvious way, which is a much better approach. So for now, we're not dealing with that, and this just allows us to see all of our data is sent using that name. Okay. So next up, we're going to take what we just learned and do a bit of a fun little demo where we're going to build our own search form for Reddit and for Google and probably YouTube, where we can send data to their server from our form and then end up actually getting a search page. So the process here is really simple. All we need to do is take advantage of the form attribute for action, where the form submits, and make sure we're following the correct pattern and using the correct name for our search query or whatever the input will be that we're sending, that value. So I'm just going to make a search on Reddit like I did here for silky chickens, or just silky, and copy that URL. So from our form, we will submit to that exact URL right there, except I'm not going to hard code in q equals silky and all of that. We're just going to go to /search. And then as we saw, if we have an input, and that input has a name, whatever that name is, I could do something like query, and then I can put a button in here just to submit or search Reddit, something like that. Whatever value is in this input will be sent to reddit.com/search. So let's check it out, refresh my page. It says search Reddit. So I'm going to search for dog. But the problem is, if I hit search, you'll see what our URL is. We got a Reddit page, but this URL has query equals dog. But the actual Reddit server is expecting, as we saw, q equals dog. So we have to match that pattern. Reddit servers are set up to expect q for that search query, not query or whatever we decided on. So just go back to q And now we're following the pattern. So let's try it. Let's go back to our form, and I'll search for, how about puppy? Search Reddit, and moment of truth here. There we go. We're getting puppy results. Look at our URL, q equals puppy. Great. So we can do the exact same thing for Google. Here is how Google is set up. It's a little confusing. If you go do a search like for pizza, the URL is absolutely massive, and it includes a whole bunch of stuff that we don't really need to care about. I'm going to get rid of pretty much all of it. I'm just looking for pizza in here. Where can I find the term pizza? Somewhere. Right. Okay, there it is. Can you see that? Q equals pizza. It follows the exact same pattern. So if I went to this URL, it's just worth checking. If I paste that in, does it work? Yes, we're searching for pizza. So I could make a form to search on YouTube, or no, geez, on Google. Oh boy. And I'll paste that URL in there. But we don't want to set Q to be pizza always. I want to be able to have an input. Same idea here, and it's going to be a text input, and we'll give it a name of Q as well. Button, search Google, and this one's very similar, right? They both have a name of Q. I'm going to refresh my page wherever it was. Here we are. I'll search Google. How about we did pizza? We'll do tacos. Search Google, and there we go. We're getting tacos. Cool. So the last one that we'll do is a little bit different. It's YouTube, and YouTube search. Finally, we have one that doesn't follow the exact same pattern. If I search for dog on here, let's look at the URL. It's /results, first of all, and the name is search_query. It is not Q. So remember, I said it's totally up to the server, the basically the company or whoever's developing this to decide on what that search term name will be. It could be anything, but we want to follow it. Now, what we're doing anyway is kind of silly and stupid and not something you would really ever do, but it does demonstrate this principle. So let's make one more form, and this one we'll submit to YouTube. So action youtube.com/results, and then we'll add in our input, and type will be text, and then we'll have name equals search_query, and add our button, search YouTube. Okay, let's see if it works. Go back. I'm going to search YouTube for, how about origami? Search. There we go. Search query equals origami. If that was anything else, it doesn't work. And it looks like we don't get a 404 or a bad error. It just takes us back to YouTube. It doesn't recognize what we asked the server for. The last thing I'll mention here is that technically if you have an input, if you don't have a button but you do have an input in a form, and let me go back to my form here, and the user hits enter, like if I hit enter right now, I'm not clicking submit, this will submit the form. So remember my form, there's really 3 forms here. Here's 1, here's 2, and here's the 3rd form. They each submit somewhere different. I like to put the button in there, and if we do put the button back in there, you can still just hit enter to submit the form. So it works. Wow, I'm amazed there are results for that, but I guess it's not that surprising. Pretty commonly typed letters together, A, S, and D. That's kind of all I wanted to show you. I think what I would do lastly is probably add in maybe some headings. So we'll have maybe an H2 here that says hijacking searches maybe, and then an H3 search Reddit, and then another H3 here, search Google, and then our final one down here, search YouTube. Sure, there we go. Slightly easier to read. Still hideous, but we haven't gotten to styling yet. We're almost there. So that's really just a demo of name and action, those 2 crucial attributes, and we're conforming, in this case, to standards or to rules set out by Reddit, Google, YouTube. It's totally up to the companies on how they want to structure things, and we're just playing by those rules once we figure them out. In this video, we'll cover some of the other inputs we have not yet seen, including things like checkboxes, radio buttons, selects or drop-downs, and text areas. So if we go back to the MDN page for the input element, as we already know, there are quite a few different types, and the ones I'm going to focus on right now are checkboxes. which, just like every other input, we create using the type attribute. So type equals checkbox. So why don't we start there? And if you look at how this works, it's input, type equals checkbox, no surprise there. We can give it a name, give it an ID so we can label it. You definitely need to label your checkboxes, otherwise it's very confusing and difficult to know what this is actually pertaining to. What am I checking? But then we can specify if the checkbox is checked to begin with or not. So we have control over that. And there are times you may want it to already be checked. For example, if this is an edit form, so I'm editing something that's already been saved once, and you want to display what I previously decided, you would need this to be checked. Anyway, let's try it out. So let's make a new form down at the bottom here. Write an H2. We'll just call this more inputs. Inputs. And then down below, we'll do a form, and our action will just, it doesn't really matter, but /birds. And then in here, in inputs, type equals checkbox. Refresh our page. There's our single checkbox. And then we can add in a name. So what should this checkbox be for? Maybe I agree. So agree to the terms or something. How about just agree will be the names, or agree _ terms of service, TOS. And then we can give it an ID. We'll just go with agree. And then a label. And you can put the label before or after. It really depends on what you prefer and if you're working with a designer and all of that. But we can move them around. But let's just do our label afterwards. And this will be a label for agree. And this will say, I agree to everything. Sure. Refresh. And now we've got our checkbox. And the label is connected so that I can click on the label to check it. That makes a big difference, especially on mobile. These checkboxes can be pretty tiny. And then the last thing I would do is just show you that we can have it begin as checked if we want it to. So now I refresh and it begins checked off rather than what we had before where it just starts off unchecked. Okay, so other than that, if I do submit this form, so why don't we add a button at the bottom? This is going to take us to /birds. Is that what I did? If I check it, what you probably, hopefully can see up here is that it sets agree terms of service to be on. And then if I just don't check it, so I'll refresh and I'll uncheck it and click submit, it doesn't send anything. It's just missing. So that's how checkboxes work. Again, we're not handling that data anyway, so it doesn't matter much right now. The next input type we'll take a look at is a radio button. Radio buttons are pretty similar to checkboxes, except for one key difference, which is that in a group of radio buttons, you can only select one. So one of these choices and only one. So they're connected, and the browser knows if you click Louis, it's going to have to make sure Huey and Dewey are unclicked or unchecked. So it's still a yes, no, right? Is this yes or no, yes or no, yes or no, but we only have one option. We can only pick one in that group. Compared to a checkbox, we can have both of these checked or none of them checked. So to do this, it's a little bit more complicated. It's just input type equals radio, so that part's not bad. Let's do that down here. Let's maybe add a paragraph, and then we'll add an input type equals radio. Also, I don't know if you just saw that. I did INP tab, and it gave me type, name, and ID all ready to go. So type is going to be radio here, and on its own, a radio button is just that right there. So I could make a couple of radio buttons. I could make 3 of them like this, but at the moment, they're completely individual. They're on their own. They're not connected, and I want them to be a group. I want you to pick one or the other one, however many I have. To do that, I need to associate them by giving them the same exact name. So name, name, name. So why don't I give them each a name? What should my radio buttons be for? How about maybe shirt size or something? So we'll go with size, size, and size. We don't have any values or anything to look at just yet, but you'll see if I click, I can only have one of them selected now because they all are grouped together. They all have the same name. So in the browser's mind, they all point to the same thing. So the next thing we should do is label each one of these. It's up to you where you want to put the label. Once again, if it's before, if it's after, if each one of these is on their own line. But for now, let's just do a label here that just says extra small. And here I'm going to go with XS as my 4 and then an ID of XS. So they should now be paired up. I click here. I've toggled that radio button. And then I'm just going to duplicate that. So label for small, which will just be S, ID of S, label for medium, and ID of M as well. Okay, so now I have these 3. I can click the label or the button, and they're grouped together. I can only click one. Now, I gave them a name of size, and if I select medium and I click submit, take a look at what was sent through. This is important. It sent size, but it said size is just on. Well, that's not really helpful, right? We want to know which one of these was selected. And to do that, we have to add on a particular attribute called value. So whatever we have in this value is not going to be displayed to a user. Instead, it's just what is sent through when the form is submitted. So as an example, here I could put value of LOLOL like that. I refresh this page. We don't see that anywhere. But if I select extra small and I submit, can you see that? I hope it's showing up. I'll just paste it here for good measure. Size is LOLOL. So whatever that value is what will be sent to the server, what will be submitted. So we want each of these to have a value as well, and they should be unique. So I'm just going to go with extra small there. Usually we want something small and self-explanatory. So for sizes, extra small, small, and medium makes perfect sense. Value equals M. Okay, so that looks good to me. Now if I select one of them and submit my form, let's agree to that. And let's go with medium, submit. And now you can see up top, we've got agree terms of service is on. That makes sense. It's just a checkbox, yes or no, on or it's not present. And then size is set to M because that's the one option out of those 3 I had selected. Okay, so that's radio buttons. A couple of new things there. The value attribute, very important in order to actually send a value, which still we're not using, but eventually we will. And also making sure that we add in name to group those elements together. Name, size, size, size. This way we can only select one of each. Cool. Next up, we have the select element, which is essentially a drop-down menu. And it actually is the product of 2 elements working together, a select element and then option elements. So the select is the parent. It groups together a bunch of options. And each option is pretty straightforward. It has some text in between the opening and closing tags. That's what we actually see here. Capital H hamster, for example. And then we have a value attribute, just like we did with our radio buttons. And this is what will be sent through when this information is submitted. So the select is where we put the name and an ID if we wanted to label it. And then we have options. So honestly, it probably would have been a better example to do a select for your shirt size, but let's just come up with something else. So let's do a select here. What should we select? What sort of drop down? How about, I don't know, let's say that this is a wedding reception or something, and we want you to pick please select a meal type, something like that, an entree. I don't know. Okay, so we're going to have steak and chicken and vegetarian and fish or something like that. So we'll add in a name in here. We'll call it meal. ID will be meal. 4 on the label is meal. So they're now associated. And if I refresh, we've got our select, but there is nothing in there. So let's add in our options. Option, and this first one will be fish maybe, and the value will be fish. But we could have something else like, vegetarian. Is that how you spell that? And then this could just be veg. If we wanted to have a shorter value that is sent to the server, it doesn't really matter though. And then we'll have, how about steak? And that could be steak as well. Okay, so let's see what we end up with here. Great, please select an entree. We've got fish, vegetarian, and steak. Let's submit that. Submit. And you'll see meal is set to steak. Whatever that value was, not the text we see here, but whatever that value is here. So this could be something entirely different. Something you'll see sometimes is the first option being sort of a dummy or placeholder option. the value is just nothing, empty quotes, and then something to distinguish it or to make it clear that we're asking you to please choose an option. You don't have to do this, but this is something you will see. And the other thing that we can do is actually have something pre-selected like this with the attribute selected on any option. Now vegetarian is pre-selected when you load the page, but you can change it. Okay, so that is the basics of a select and the option elements. They work together. You use option inside of a select, and that's kind of it for that. In this video, I'm just going to wrap up our discussion around inputs and different form controls. There are plenty of elements or different form controls we have not yet covered and probably won't. For example, it's pretty uncommon to use a week picker or a month picker, a date time local. All of these are here, but we're not going to spend much time on them. But there are a couple that I do want to highlight, and they don't really have a lot to do with one another, but I'm just going to make this quick. So the first one is range. A range input creates a little slider where a user can select some value on a sliding range. And we can control the minimum and maximum values. So this could be going from 0 to 100, or it could be going from 500 to 520. It's totally up to us using different attributes. But the way that we create this slider and this range input, surprise, surprise, is input type equals range. So why don't I do that here? I'll do a paragraph, an input type equals range. And what should our range input be for? How about, we'll do a label here. How about amount of cheese? Sure. And this will be a label for cheese. ID needs to be cheese. Great. So now we've got our label connected to our range input. And let's also figure out what the minimum and maximum values are. We can set that using min and max attributes. So let's do that right here. Let's do min equals, what should our cheese go to or go from? How about just 1 to 10? Max equals 10. So you're not going to notice a huge difference here. It is a little bit different because now I can only step 10 times. It's not as smooth. And if I submit this, let's say it's, let's go to 9 right there. Submit. Oh, I never gave it a name. That's my fault. Let's give it a name. Cheese level, maybe. Try that again. Let's set it up to 9. Submit. Cheese level equals 9. If I go all the way down to the bottom, it should equal 1, and the top should be 10. Now I could also change that. I could make that 100. And now my cheese level goes to 1, or from 1 to 100. And I can also give it a step. So that step could be, 7, which is a bit odd. But now I'm going from 0 or 1 or whatever we started at, and then up by 7. So if I go all the way to the top and then go down one little notch, it should be, 92? We're going down by 7. So if I go all the way down to the bottom and then go up by 1, we're at 8 because it started at 1, then it adds 7, so, we get to 8. So we're jumping up by 7 each time. Very bizarre. So I'll get rid of that. And we can also give it an initial value. So we're going from 1 to 100. I could give it a value at the beginning of, how about 75? Refresh, and there we are. It always starts there, but we can move it. Okay. So that's range inputs. These are relatively commonly used, not on every single form, but I figured you should know about them. The next one I'll show you, along these same lines, we actually have already seen this. It's the number input from way early all the way up here. I just wanted to show you we can do the same thing with a min and a max. So if I go back to my number, where are you? Input type equals number. I can give it a min. So this is supposed to be any number. How about min will be 1, max will be 10. Now, it shrinks down quite a bit. We can use CSS to change that, but maybe let's go max of 1,000. And you'll see that I can't go down below 1, and I couldn't go above 1,000. I'm not going to, I guess I could do this. And I can't go above 1,000. So we also have a step here if we wanted, step equals 2. This is going to give us, odd numbers? 1, 3, 5, and so on. Okay, so that is the same principle, but this time it's with a number input. The other one was a range input. Now, the next thing we'll take a look at is completely unrelated. It's not even an input, actually. It is a completely separate element called a text area. A text area you definitely have seen before online or just using websites. It is basically a multi-line text input. So it's where you can type and hit enter and like actually type a paragraph, an essay, all sorts of things. And these are not an input, right? They are a text area element where you have an opening and closing tag. So here, maybe down at the bottom, we'll do a paragraph, maybe with a label that says something like any special requests, ? And we'll add in a text area just like that. And we could just leave it at that, but we should label it definitely. So ID will be maybe requests, for requests. Okay, let's refresh. And here is our text area, and I can start typing. Now, there are a couple of things that we can do. We can control the initial number of rows. I don't remember, I guess it just defaults to 2 rows, so you can see there. But I can give it more. I can set rows to be 10. And we'll get a much longer, much taller text area. The thing is, though, I can go past that still, right? I just get a scroll bar. So we're setting that initial height, the number of rows. What else can we do? We can set the width using columns. We should give it a name. Should definitely do that. So let's give it a name. Probably just requests as well. I guess I'll give it a calls, just so you have this as a reference. How about calls of 20? How does that look? Is that the default? Is it really? How about 40? Yep, it was the default. And we could just, this is kind of hacky, but put a break in there for now. There we go. You can also set a placeholder. So placeholder special, I don't know, type something here. How about that? And there we go. That's pretty much it for a text area. So we can control the height and the width using rows and columns. We can give it placeholder text, but remember, it is not an input. Almost everything we've seen is an input with a type, except for select, which we saw, where we have options and select. And then here, text area is its own standalone element as well. Okay, that's pretty much it for the most important, most commonly used form controls. There are others, as we've seen, but those are the essentials. We've got one more important topic around forms for now, which are validations. So the term validations generally refers to adding constraints or validating user input or data. For example, requiring that some fields can't be empty, or that a password has to be between, 7 and 12 or 20 characters, or whatever it is. There are these different constraints, and they can get more complex, like your password must have a special character and a number and a lowercase letter and an uppercase letter and no spaces, and there are these different things that we can validate. Now, we're not going to go into all of that right now. I'm going to show you the built-in browser validations that we can add into our forms and our inputs, but the smoother experience is things like this here on Stripe, where as I'm typing, and it just tells me immediately before I did anything, it's not a valid email, or as I type my password, I get this nice sort of security bar gauge, and I get this text down here telling me what's wrong, or what it needs to do, and it's showing and hiding, and it turns green. That is all done with JavaScript. So this is all in the browser or client-side validation, just like what I'm going to show you, but this is in addition to what I'm going to show you, and we'll learn how to do this sort of thing later on. This is definitely a nice experience. But what I will say is there's something else called server-side validation, which is when I actually submit this data. Right now it won't even let me submit, but if I did submit it, there could also be validations on the server, on, in this case, Stripe server, to make sure that my data meets their expectations. It's possible that somebody could get past this. There might be a bug, their email. It would be hard here, but somebody could directly send data to Stripe server, and it might not conform to this pattern. This is purely through the browser, making sure that the data you enter into these fields matches some pattern, but somebody could go around it. Somebody could send their own request or, use a terminal or something to send data to Stripe, and they likely also have validations on the server side. So those are two different terms, and in the past, server-side validation was pretty common. In the earlier days it's still around, where you would type something, fill everything out, then you hit submit, the page refreshes, and then it tells you if there's any problems, because it's hitting a server first and then coming back and telling you here are the issues. Anyway, we're going to focus on the basics of the built-in validations, and the first thing we need to know is a particular attribute called required. So I can require any of the inputs so far that we've learned just by adding that attribute, required. So I'm going to add in a new, how about an H2 here, validations demo. We'll add in a form. This will go to / dummy. And inside of that, let's add in a couple of inputs. The first one, type equals text. We'll give it a name of, I don't know, should we just do first name? Let's do first, like that. We'll give it a label. Enter first name. 4 will be first, so ID needs to be first. Okay, so a lot of attributes there just to get set up. But now I should have this enter first name, and then I need a way, let's add a button to submit the form. Right now, I can leave that blank. So as you can see, first is set to nothing. It's totally blank. If I want to require a value here, I can add on this required attribute, and now I can't submit. The browser is telling me, please fill this out first, and then I can submit. So this is coming from Chrome. You might see a different looking error message here, depending on the browser you're in. And this may not be fully implemented, by the way, across every browser. These days it's pretty standard and common, but it's not a guarantee. So we also have validations for the min and maximum length of text. So I could do this for a password, for example, or I could do this, how about a username? So let's do a label for username. We'll put a paragraph around it, and then in here an input, it will be text, and ID will be username, name is username, okay, and then we can give it a min length. How about your username has to be between 5 and a max length of 20 characters, okay? So now if I have a 1 character or 3 character username, it's going to yell at me that this is required. Now it tells me, please lengthen this to 5 characters or more. You currently have 3. So I'll lengthen it too much, and you'll see it actually doesn't let me type anymore. I've hit the maximum length, and there we go. So I also should add required. Right? I did not require that input at the bottom, so you can leave it blank, which maybe there's a situation where something should be optional, but in this case, I'll also make it required. So it has to be there, and it has to be between 5 and 20 characters. So min length, max length. There's also min and max, which are for numeric values. So this could be used for things like in a date, a month, a week, a time, or in a range or number input. As we've already seen, min and max play an important role there. If I go to one of these inputs, like this number input all the way up here, we did from 1 to 1,000. But if I were to enter in something like -1, which is not valid, it still lets me type it. But when I submit, it will yell at me, value must be greater than or equal to 1. So if I use the arrows, it won't let me go down there. But if I type something in, it lets me do it, but it won't let me submit. So those validations are still there as well. So that's required, min length, max length, min and max, which are for the range inputs and for number inputs, as well as these others that we're not going to worry about for now. But we also have some inputs that actually have a default validation built in. They are matching a pattern. So pattern is actually an attribute we can add to elements, and we can define something called a regular expression. We're not going to go into it now. All you need to know is that regular expressions are incredibly useful. We'll touch on them later on, but they are quite dense and crazy to try and understand. I think I have one on my clipboard here. Yes, this is a regular expression here. It's a pattern that is being defined. I think this one is, let's see, 1 or more lowercase letters, uppercase letters. It's got to be at least 8 for the password, special characters. Basically, it's saying there's got to be a number, uppercase letter, lowercase letter, and a couple of other things, and there's got to be at least 8 of them. So it's complicated to explain. It takes a lot of time, and we don't need to care about it right now. What we can do is set our own regular expression using this pattern attribute. We're not going to do that, but you can. Another thing that we can do, though, is use some of the existing elements that have pattern matching already built in. For example, if we have an input, so I'll just do a paragraph here, input where type is set to email. If I refresh, I'm going to have to fill these guys out so it doesn't yell at me. If I submit right now, oh, I didn't require it. So let's make that required. Try again. Enter something in here. Okay, submit. It will tell me, please fill this out. So I'll enter something in, and it's not a valid email, and it tells me, please include an @ in the email address. So it's just matching a pattern. It's not checking to see if this is a real email. It's really just seeing if there's an @ sign and then something afterwards. If I leave that off, it asks me to please enter a part following the @ sign. It's incomplete. But once again, this still could be a completely fake email, and it doesn't matter. It's just the pattern. But it's still better than nothing. And the other type, the other option I'll show you for now is a URL input. So type equals URL. I'm going to comment this one out just to make this easier. And if I type something like that, just the letter D, it's going to tell me, please enter a URL. And you can control, I believe you can control how this URL is validating what the pattern is. We're not going to go into it, but I just want to show you that it exists. It looks like it's looking for this pattern. So some URL scheme like HTTP or HTTPS : something else. So let's verify. If I just do D, it doesn't like that. If I do HTTP : DDDD, that's fine. But if I leave off some of that, it gets mad at me and it wants a valid URL. Again, not checking to see if it's a real URL, but just the pattern. So we also have an input type of telephone, TEL. I think there's a couple others, but we're not going to worry about them for now. I just wanted to show a few, give you sort of an overview of built-in validations for HTML forms. I will wrap up by just cleaning this up a little bit, adding labels when appropriate, adding comments, so you don't have to look at this mess. And that about wraps it up for validations for now. So next up, it's time for a bit of a larger exercise around forms. I'm going to ask you to build a form for a marathon, a running, foot race, registration, where we've got, a couple of different inputs of different types, and they are all correctly labeled. Obviously, it looks like complete garbage, but we can't do anything about that at the moment without CSS, so we're just going to make do. So it's just about the underlying mechanics, the structure of the form. So I'll walk you through, what it is and the different inputs I'm expecting. I'll also have a code along if you just want to build it with me. Definitely do whatever you feel comfortable with. But there is a form element here wrapping everything. I've got a first name input. It's just text. Last name, also text. They're both required. So if I try and submit the form, it's going to yell at me about that. Also, they're correctly labeled. So I can click on that label. That's just one way to tell. And then I have focus in that input. Then I have this here, select a race, fun run, 5K, half marathon, or full marathon. 3 radio buttons, and they're connected, meaning I can only select one. And they are labeled as well, so I can click the label in order to select each one. This is just a paragraph, it's just text. I wouldn't worry about that. If you're trying to recreate this, just focus on the inputs. Then we have email. So email is going to be an email type input. If I try and register, it's going to tell me right now, I specified this is an email input, and this is not following the correct pattern to be an email. Then our password. Then we've got this age group drop down where there's a label, and I would like you to pick, some set of age groups. It really doesn't matter. You could just have 2 in here, 3. You don't need to copy exactly what I have, but there should be a drop down here with some options. And that's pretty much it. There's a button to submit. It doesn't matter where the form submits to. As we briefly talked about, forms are going to send data somewhere else. We don't have anywhere to send it. So it's just about creating the form itself. Also, I did use a couple of divs, and there's a paragraph here just to break things up. You'll notice first name and last name are grouped together. You do not need to do that, but this is what it looks like if you don't use some sort of div or paragraphs or something to break your content up. We get a very long horizontal form. So I elected to not do that and to instead group certain things with divs to just add some extra space. So in the next video, we'll go ahead and create this. I recommend, as always, that you attempt this on your own. I know it's not the most riveting thing ever, but we will be building quite a few forms. They all follow a very similar pattern. Even if they look nicer than this form, they still have the same underlying bones. So go ahead, give it a shot. In the next video, I'll code it up from scratch. All right, let's go ahead and build this from scratch. Hopefully it doesn't take too long. The first thing we'll do is create my basic skeleton. So I'm in a file called marathonform.html. There we go. Thank you to VS Code. And then in here, we'll just do, I don't know, register form. Great. And then I'm going to create an H1 up top that just says race registration. And then I'll open it up in the browser and just make sure I have it. By the way, I'm way zoomed in here because, it looks a little scrawny to have all this empty white space. So I figure might as well make it as large as possible for students to see. Okay, so there we go, our H1. Then we need our form element. And recall that this action is going to determine where the form submits data to, but we don't care about it for now. It will be very important when we're submitting data somewhere, but we're not doing that. So I'll just leave it blank for now. Then we're going to add in our first set of elements. We're going to work on the first name and last name. Those are both just text inputs. So let's do our first input. Type is text, and then I'll also do a label, and this one will say first name. And I'll call this first. The for attribute will be first, which means I need an ID with the matching text of first, and they should now be connected. Click, and then we're focused. All right, I didn't specify that you needed to add placeholder text, but you can if you'd like. Always a good idea, but it should never take the place of a label. Labels are accessible, placeholders are not, or at least they're not as accessible. Okay, so I'm also going to give each input a name, which again is not going to make an impact for us, but it is good to have when we do submit data. This will be the name used to submit that data under. Now I'm just going to duplicate this and do the same thing for last name. So our ID will be last, and then this will say last name. Easy enough. There we go. Click here. Okay, so that part is done. Next up, we have this chunk. So these are 3 radio buttons. We can start there. If you recall how radio buttons work, it's just an input where type is radio. And if I use Emmet in VS Code, right, I can just type input, I'll do it one more time, colon, radio, or colon color, or whatever that value after colon is will be used for the type. So I want radio. And then each one of these needs a label. So I'm going to make a label for now for this one radio button that's going to say, what I do, fun run 5K. I think I put the label after the radio button. So if we're going to be consistent, that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that as long as I connect them. So this one will be 5K. Now I'm spelling 5K out, or maybe I'll do fun run. You're not supposed to have an ID that starts with a number, so I'm not going to do that. We'll do fun run. And yes, this isn't an ID, but here it is, right? ID fun run. And then fun run 5K. Let's make sure they're connected. If I click, we do select it. Great. And then the name here is the value that will be sent, the name of the value. We'll call it race. And we need that name to be the same for all 3 of our radio buttons if we want them to be connected, if we want the browser to consider them as part of the same piece of data, right? You can only pick one out of these 3. So keep that as race. This one, though, will be half as the ID, half marathon. And then this one will just be full marathon. Okay, let's see how that looks. Label, not quite. So I screwed up that label. Oh, duh, I didn't change this to full. Okay, so half and half, full and full, fun run, fun run. Now I click and it works. Click here, click there, and I can only have one of the 3 selected. Now, I did break this up into multiple lines. So what I did is I put a div around these 2 first, just to group them together anyway. You could also use, I debated using a section, but I didn't know. I didn't think it was the best use of a section, just a section of a form. You could do that. And then I did a paragraph here that said select a race, like that. And then I just did a div around each pair to force them onto their own line, right? So we end up with this for that first one, and then just duplicate that again for the second pair, and then again for the third pair. Now this really is not important compared to the labels and the inputs. That's what matters. But there we are. Well, this is Colt from the future. A couple, 2 months after I originally recorded this video and uploaded it, the course has been live. And multiple people pointed out an issue that I am here to fix, or at least address. So far, in our form, this is the completed version, by the way, so it's not going to match up exactly with where I interrupted this video, but what I want to call your attention to are the radio buttons. In my code, in the radio buttons, each one has type, attribute set to radio, a name set to something, an ID set to something to work with the label, but they're missing a very important attribute, which is the value attribute. Recall that the value attribute on a radio button is the actual value assigned to each option. So what piece of information will be sent if I select half marathon as an example? Well, if I submit this form, and remember, we're not really sending it anywhere, but we can see, I don't know if that's going to show up. Let me just copy this over here so you can see it a little bit clearer. We have first name, Jones, race, right here, race equals on. So the actual information that was sent for this entire set of radio buttons, which is grouped with the name attribute of race, right? Here we go, race, name is race, name is race. All that we got was race equals on. So not very helpful. What we want to do is send through a specific value for each one of these options. So I'm going to add a value attribute. So it's not going to alter anything that we see on the form. But once we actually work with form data and send data somewhere, we absolutely want those values. And also, just to be complete, we want to have a value there. So value here, I'll just do the same as the ID. So fun run, and then value here will be half, and then full. So again, won't make a difference to what we see, but I'm going to save, and then I'll refresh. Okay. So let's see what happens. I have half marathon selected. I'll click register. Let's copy what we have up top. I'll blow it up down here. And where are you? Got to scroll through all of that lovely stuff. Here we are. Race equals half. So now that value that I checked this one. It says half marathon to me, my eyes as a reader, but really what we're sending through is just the word half. That's the value associated with this input. Anyway, I apologize for the interruption, but I thought I should address that, and it's kind of hard to just put all that in a text annotation or as a note, so that's why I interrupted you. Now we're going to go back to building the rest of the form, and you'll see in the rest of the video I don't have those value attributes there, but the solution code has the value attributes, as well as this interruption has those attributes. So put those in there, and that's it. Back to the version of me from 2 months ago recording this video. Bye. Next up, we've got two more inputs, an email and a password input. So I'm going to do another div, and then input type is email. Nope, I hit enter too early. There we are. Name will be email. ID will also be email. And then the label will just be for email to match that ID. And then here we'll type email. And let's see, there it is. Let's also do password. So label for password, we can just preemptively come up with that ID, password, and then input type is password. Name will be password, and ID will be password. They should be connected. Click on the label. Yep. Click on the label here. Looks good. This is a password input. Great. And then what do we have at the end? We've got the button and then select age group. So that will be a label for this select. And then our select will have a couple of options. So we'll do another div. We'll put a select in there. We'll call this maybe division, group, age group, something like that. Make sure it matches division as well. Select age group. And then we need a series of option elements, and each option needs a value and it needs some text. So let's go with under 18. We'll call that kids. Duplicate that a couple of times. 18 to, 40. Call that adults. No, let's not do that. Let's do 18 to 35 or something. 30. That will be, sure, young adults. And then 30 to 50, maybe 30 to 60. I don't know. These aren't very fair age rankings or age groupings. In a real marathon situation, they're far smaller groups. 30 to 50, that's quite the span. Anyway, this is fine, though. We'll just go with adults and then seniors for 50 plus. It's just not really senior, but good enough. All right, so there we are. A couple of options there. And then finally, we need a button to submit. Button, we'll go with register. Okay, so there's a couple things, at least one that I'm missing, which is that these are supposed to be required inputs. And right now, I can leave them off. That's totally fine. So I need to require these 4 inputs here, and that's easy to do. I just need to find them. I'm just going to make multiple cursors by holding option as I click, and do it again here for email and password. And then I'll just add required, just like that. Save, refresh, and now it's going to bug me about putting something in there and there. And then here, if I left it off, first it would say required. Now it's going to complain that it's not a valid email, or at least that it doesn't follow an email pattern. And then password needs to be filled out as well. Okay. And there we go. It submits all that horrible data and just refreshes the page because I didn't specify a different action. I just said nothing, just refresh the page. That's where you're sending the data to. But that's all that matters for now, just setting up our form. It's a lot of work, but it's something we do frequently. We'll get a lot of practice. Definitely want to make it very clear that labels should always be there. They're important, even if they seem silly, even if it's annoying to connect them. For accessibility purposes, always include labels. So that's our form. Time to go run a marathon.